His name was Eric Jameson, and he saved Stragview from the riot of 2017. Eric Jameson, Officer Jameson, was probably the nicest guy you'd ever meet. He was a career officer, a man who'd forgotten more about corrections than most of us had ever known. His appearance was vaguely Chinese, or maybe Korean. He always wore his hair in one of those buns, his widow's peak never touching the thick gray mane on the top. He always reminded me of Uncle Iroh from Avatar, and the way he spoke and carried himself was very reminiscent of the character. I got to work with him on my first night flying solo on the compound, and it was an experience I wouldn't trade for anything. When you walked with him through the quad, it was as though the clouds lifted away from the sun. Inmates smiled more. Officers were less surly. Everyone was just in a better mood when Jameson was around. He was personable, remembering inmates' names and asking about their troubles. He passed 5 times as much time in the quad as any other officer I'd ever known, a practice that would have gotten anyone but Jameson dragged into the investigator's office under speculation of inmate collusion. Jameson did the same to his fellow officers, though, and I never saw anyone snap or take a surly tone with Jameson. He was knowledgeable, sharing his wisdom willingly, and the way he walked amongst his charges was utterly devoid of fear or care. He walked through the quad as though it were his home, and the inmates were no more than his neighbors, whom he was greeting on his way home from work. This was not a skill he had gained from years of experience, though. Jameson had a way about him, that was undeniable. Jameson had a vibration about him that broke up tension. It was an ability you had to see firsthand. It was an ability I actually got to see firsthand. About a year after I started with the department, we had a significant disturbance in F Dorm. What had started as a skirmish between rival gangs had developed into a fight that threatened to bathe the whole quad in blood. It all came to a head at lunchtime. The 2 gangs had taken advantage of the other inmates leaving and took the opportunity to privately air their grievances. We were all poised to roll into the dorm with force. Blood and weapons were already present in the quad when Jameson stepped into the corridor. The captain had just finished up a blistering speech designed to prep us for the coming scuffle when Jameson walked through the door and stepped inside. 20 or so men looked at him, their faces covered in a veneer of readiness, and their resolve melted away before we could take a single step towards the door. He spoke to the 2 groups for less than a minute before both were ready to end the hostilities and submit to the officers in the hallway. Jameson came out of the quad with a peaceful smile stretched across his old young face. "They're ready to comply, Captain," he said, his voice like a gentle river. That was when I felt it. It was like someone hit a tuning fork. You can feel it vibrate through your skin, in your teeth, in your gray matter as it washes over you. This was like that, except it was more like a gentle wind chime or a soft temple bell. I saw it wash over the others in the hall as well, and a general atmosphere of calm permeated everyone. Even the captain, who had been ready to spit nails when Jameson had walked onto the quad, smiled and clapped the grandfatherly fellow on the shoulder as he admonished him for his efforts. I saw Jameson later as he came out of the area next to the captain's office that held the snack machines, and I asked him about it. He just smiled. "Oh, just years of know-how. It's all about knowing how to say and when to say it. You'll pick it up, little brother." I shook my head, my body wanting to smile and agree with him as his proximity made me feel easy again. "No, I mean, the thing that happened when you talked in the hallway. I heard a kind of a chime?" I tried lamely. I couldn't properly describe the emotion because it wasn't something I'd ever felt before. The others seemed to accept it, almost seemed to welcome the feeling of ease that wafted around Jameson like a fog. I, on the other hand, wanted some answers. I wasn't one to just accept things as they were, and I hoped this was something he was aware of. If it wasn't, I was about to sound very crazy to someone that I respected. Jameson smiled, chuckling a little in the face of my confusion. "You're a little more pragmatic than the others, I see. Yes, I suppose you'd call it a tone. Since I was young, I've had it. A kind of aura that creates peaceful feelings in those around me. It's a gift I often use around here. I was astonished. You mean you have this gift for bringing peace to those around you, and you use it in a prison? He took a chip from the bag and chewed it speculatively, as though thinking about how he would answer the question. When I was 13, I thought I might use the ability to become a diplomat or a politician. If I could bring peace to those around me, I could be an asset to those in trying situations. I soon realized, though, that positions like that were out of the reach of my less-than-rich family. I thought then about training to be an actor, someone who could affect change by the nature of celebrity. That was another path that was closed to me, however. The climate at that time was not kind to Asian immigrants, even those not hailing from Japan. I then considered the army. Maybe I could do some good as an officer, and someone with my skill set would be useful on the battlefield. The Vietnam War was raging, and it was far better to enlist than to be drafted. I joined and served my time, but I never made it onto the battlefield. Instead, I was sent to a Navy vessel and told to cook, something I was good at. I slung hash for the next 8 years and retired with a pension and an unfulfilled ideal. As he told me his tale, I could almost imagine the younger man he had been. He had been full of ideas and hopes, just like me, and he felt dissatisfied by the world at large. He had a talent, but the world didn't see fit to use that talent. Sometimes it seems like the world makes things harder for itself. I confided in an officer while aboard the USS Copeland that I had a gift for making people calm. He laughed until I proved it by calming a group of tired flightmen who were milling about the landing zone. They went from scowling and mumbling to smiling and going about their task with purpose within a second of me talking to them. He asked how this could be possible, and I told him about my strange aura. The officer, however, told me it might be best to keep this ability to myself. I would likely be thrown out as a loony, or worse, kept in a lab somewhere and experimented on by people who believed me. He sighed and seemed to stare off into space, reliving his glory days. So there I was, 26, unemployed, and looking for the next place to use my talents. I considered a career in medicine, but I didn't have the memory or the stomach for it. I considered law enforcement, but my academy scores were never good enough to qualify. Corrections, on the other hand, decided that they would take me gladly. That was back in '76, and a man with no family and an open schedule can find all sorts of work in this department. I signed on with Stragview, and I've been here for nearly 30 years. Yeah, but why? I cut in. Jameson looked across the yard, taking in the dorms and the chain link, and seemed to miss it already. Did you know that while I've been here, uses of force have declined by 45% from the year previous to my hiring? When I'm on shift, the need for physical force is at an all-time low. This prison sits on a nexus, son. I'm sure you've noticed some strange things around here. As he said it, his eyes twinkled a little in the moonlight. Thinking back on it, I had indeed seen some strange things within the walls of Stragview. Sometimes, some unexplainable things. If my presence here can cause even one officer to leave in his car as opposed to in an ambulance, then my time here has been well spent. I do not consider my talents squandered. Quite the contrary. I think this is where they might be best served. I always found that profound when I looked back on it. I did before that night, at least. 6 months ago, Officer Jameson told me that he was retiring. I was working inside at this point. The captain liked to have me on his yard team, and I liked being a part of it. I was going to pick up his count slips when he gave me the good news. Next month will mark my 30 years of service with the department. After 30 years, I think I might be ready for some much overdue rest. I asked him how he meant to spend his retirement, and he told me about a piece of property he owned with a fish pond and a hunting lease. He intended to hunt, to fish, to care for his garden, and maybe even write his memoirs about his time in the war and his time with DOC. He seemed happy when he spoke about these things, and I was happy for him. He seemed pleased at the prospect of rest, and I wished him joy of his newfound freedom. By the end of the month, he was gone, and we settled into life without Jameson at Stagview Prison. When I arrived at work the next day, the change was immediate. The air around Stagview had always been heavy. The place seemed almost Lovecraftian at times, and an air of oppression seemed to roll in with the fog most mornings. Today, though, it seemed different. It felt like it might rain at any minute, and it was the first time I had ever thought about just climbing back into my truck and driving home. We used force that night. It was the ugly kind of force, the kind you use on desperate men. His name was Daffin, and it all started because he was hungry. Like many inmates, Daffin decided to sneak a second tray from the food line. Officer Wilde stopped him on the way through the chow hall and told him to give up the tray. Inmate Daffin explained that he had paid for this extra tray, not uncommon in prison economics, but Wilde was hearing none of it. He snatched the tray and told Daffin to take his ass to his table and not to treat him like some rookie. Daffin responded by punching Officer Wilde in the face. Officer Wilde responded by breaking his jaw and nearly kicking off the first chow hall riot I had ever seen. We got them calmed down, and Daffin went to the infirmary while Wilde went home. I had seen violence on the compound before, but this was the closest I'd ever seen to it coming off the rails. Tensions remained high for the rest of the night, but I would soon discover that the chow hall incident was just an overture. The week after that, the outbreak started. The previous week had been hard. 4 stabbings, 3 fights, 3 assaults on staff, and 2 attempted suicides had made it the longest week I could remember. Daffin had gone to the hospital in the midst of it, his jaw re-breaking when he tried to break up one of the fights. And when they called me in on Monday, my first day off, I was not happy. I wasn't alone though. Most of my shift was called in to lock down 2 of our open bay dorms. Daffin had come back from the hospital with something, and it was spreading like wildfire. We were never sure if it was the flu or what exactly it was, but it made them cough and snot and acted more like pneumonia than anything. After the 5th inmate had been rushed to the hospital, they put another dorm on lockdown. After the first death, they put nearly all the dorms on lockdown. The only 2 dorms not on lockdown by the end of the month were H and F. This was only because they were under too high a custody to get close to the infected inmates, which worked against them this time. They became responsible for cooking the meals, packed in styrofoam, and trucked down to the dorms. These were men with no experience in the kitchen, and as the quality of the food began to slip, the quarantine dorms began to make more and more noise. We were living in a powder keg, and a single spark would be all it would take to blow us all to kingdom come. That spark came on the night of the riot. I had just got on shift when the call about a fight came down. 2 officers from the previous shift were sent to help the dorm officer quell the disturbance. After I got my equipment, I headed that way to see if they needed help. When the siren went off, I knew something terrible had gone down. I could see the doors of the dorm, and the inmates were pressed against them as the maglocks held them in place. The officers in the station had been quick enough to engage the security locks, and I could see Creast glancing over his shoulder as he shunted an inmate away from the dorm. You could hear the blatting siren from halfway across the world, so when we got the word that F dorm was in an uproar, we weren't terribly surprised. When they came boiling out of the side doors like angry cockroaches, that did surprise us a little. We'd been suited up for a breach, preparing to enter the side doors of H dorm and rescue a wounded officer. The 6 of us were preparing to enter when a mob of howling inmates came spilling down the lawn. We would later find out that they had somehow gained access to the station and took the door off its lockdown. At that moment, though, all we could do was fall back for the gate and try to quell the tide. We spent the better part of the night holding the center gate. The inmates would push to the gate, attempt to rush us, and fall back after we put a few of them down. Killing isn't something you know you can do until you've had to do it, and the sight of these men sprawled out on the grass still haunts me a little. Our usual team, a 6-man group that joked and laughed through our weekly drills, were not toting empty guns tonight. Every weapon had lethal ammunition, and our goal seemed to be more than the usual rescue the CO and quell the inmates scenario. We had put down another 6 when someone came to relieve another officer named Hardy and I. The 2 of us were taken to the warden's office, where he sat drinking tea as though this were just another day. The warden looked well put together for someone awake in the dead of night. His pinstripes were immaculate, his salt and pepper hair was uniform, and his gold-rimmed glasses were polished to a high gloss. He smiled at us, wolfishly, as we entered, and the smile was wide and toothy. I suddenly had a bad feeling that we were about to be called upon to do something not altogether legal. I didn't like the warden much. I had only seen him a few times, and every time he had made my stomach turn over. During my interview, as the assistant warden and the captain of my prospective shift had asked me questions, he had just sat there, staring at me. His eyes were predatory, calculating, and it was easy to imagine that he could see right through you as his eyes bore into your very soul. He had interrupted the assistant warden mid-question to tell him that I had the job, and it had taken everything in my power to reach across and shake that hand. Now I wish I'd never taken the job. "I need you boys to go on a little errand for me," he said, glancing over the rim of his cup like a mischievous cat. I almost fancied that his eyes changed as he spoke. He gave us directions and sent us out in a state van. As I rode shotgun, I wasn't happy about what we'd been told to do. The warden wanted us to go to an address and pick up a CO who would help us with our current situation. The CO in question was known to all of us. He had been on our shift until just last month. The general tremors around the compound have changed drastically since he left. We need a man of his talents back at work where he belongs, the warden had said. We were going to roust Jameson from his much-deserved rest. The whole trip I felt very conflicted about this little errand. Jameson had earned the right to his rest, and we were going to drag him back to a place he had only recently escaped. Sometimes I joked with certain inmates that I had another 27 years before my release date, and I was doing a 30-year stint myself. This made me wonder if, at the end of the day, would they be free to pull me back too? I didn't like the idea of that. We pulled up in front of the house around 3 a.m. and found him waiting on the front porch. He had put his uniform back on, his hair scooped into its typical warrior's knot, and he looked utterly at peace. I could feel his tone when I climbed out of the van, a calming breeze that blew across my face. But as we approached, I began to feel a strangeness amongst the notes, a discord that pervaded the tone. He was presenting it for us, but was far from committed to the feeling. "Sergeant Hardy, to what do I owe the pleasure of your company so early in the morning?" Hardy paused for a moment and pressed on. "I assume that you know, dressed as you are. I think you were waiting for us, maybe." Jameson nodded placidly. "Maybe. Maybe I woke up and sensed that my gifts were needed. Regardless, I am ready." He sat in the back, and I chose to sit with him as Hardy drove. I felt less and less sure about this errand the longer it went on. It almost felt like we were escorting this man to his incarceration, if not his execution. He sat smiling, looking straight ahead as Hardy drove, and I found myself staring at him with ill ease. He turned his smiling eyes to me, and my unease deepened. He looked like a man whose mind is at peace with his own death. "What's on your mind, son?" he asked. I shook my head. I just don't feel good about what we're doing. It feels wrong. Suddenly I was assaulted by his calming aura, and it washed over me like a warm bath. "All will be fine. All is as it should be." He gripped my hand and squeezed, and I felt at peace all the way back to the compound. We arrived to find the National Guard vehicles in the parking lot. They had finally arrived, it seemed, and were preparing to go inside and gain control. We rolled through the front gate onto the compound, taking Jameson in through the front gate entrance. He climbed out of the back, looking around with a sense of homecoming, and we made our way to the center gate. Jameson floated between us, the picture of composure, but those jangles were still present amongst the calming aura he exuded. We led him, Hardy and I on either side of him, but it was he who truly led us. When we approached the line at the gate, the captain nodded at Jameson. His look was full of something, but at the time I couldn't place it. Jameson patted his shoulder and stepped towards the mass of inmates keeping a muddled perimeter near the gate, just outside of shotgun range. "Jameson, what are you doing?" I called out, stepping towards him. "They'll tear you apart." The captain stopped me with an outstretched hand. Let him work. This ain't his first rodeo. The inmates noticed him and began to move towards him like a swarm of angry bees. He didn't falter in his course, never wavered, but as he neared, I felt him reach out with that odd tone and give them the full brunt of his power. They charged him, raising clubs and shanks, but staggered as they came within 10 feet of the man. They began to sway, began to fall, and as I watched, they all fell on their faces in the grass and placed their hands behind their backs. They fell like cordwood, weapons spilling from limp fingers, as they lay smiling on the grass in placid compliance. It was at that moment that I understood the terrifying extent of Jameson's power. It was then that I understood why he had never been allowed to be a general, or a politician, or a diplomat, or anything more than a minder of the dregs of society. Had Jameson been a very different man, he could have used his power to devastating effects. There was no way that a just and loving God would have allowed a man to be tested so, without corruption. We spent the next hour putting zip cuffs on inmates as Jameson moved across the compound. We couldn't take him into the dorms, of course. We couldn't risk such a weapon in the confined space behind the doors, but it seemed we didn't have to. Just his presence on the yard quelled much of the riots, and we began to receive reports of inmates throwing down their weapons and returning to compliance. As Jameson walked, order began to reassert itself. As Jameson went, so peace went in his wake. He saved us from the riot that would have taken days to quell. He saved hundreds of lives. And how did we repay him? We were on the rec yard when it happened. We had cuffed them and were processing inmates on the yard as they tried to regain some normalcy. We identified the instigators, threw the others back in their dorm, and the light of dawn was just beginning to peek above the horizon. The warden had come out with an armed escort and was overseeing the operation with the captain, Hardy, and myself. Jameson was continuing to calm the situation, his tone stretching out like an ocean wave, and when he ambled over to our group, he was haggard but smiling. It had taken something out of him to use it, and he looked ready to drop. The warden extended a hand to Jameson, and he looked at it hesitantly before he shook it. "Excellent work, Jameson. We've missed your little gift around here. How would you like to come back? I can see that you're promoted, move to admin shift, and put you up somewhere cozy." Jameson smiled, but shook his head. "I do not think so, sir. I'm willing to lend my gift now and again, but I've found that I quite like retirement." The warden feigned a look of regret. "I was afraid you'd say that." The captain's shotgun stock cracked against the back of Jameson's head, and he fell face first onto the grass. I had my gun slung around and pointed at them before I could stop myself. The captain swung the barrel of his shotgun around to cover me, but the warden shoved it away and stepped between my gun barrel and the group. His eyes did that funny thing again, where they shifted to something almost cat-like. He didn't look angry or afraid, but was instead curious as he studied me with his strange eyes. "You know what must be done. If he leaves the compound, it will descend back into chaos. So, he mustn't be allowed to leave. You know this is the best thing for the prison. A little sacrifice for the good of us all." I pointed the gun at them, wanting to pull the trigger. If I did, though, I'd have to pull it on myself next. I'd known what would happen here. Hadn't I felt it at the beginning? The gun held firm for a count of 10, the warden standing between us, the captain looking nervous, Hardy's eyes darting for the best course of escape. Eventually, I dropped my gun barrel and let it hang underneath my arm. The warden said to grab him, so we did. We took him through the rec office and down a flight of stairs I had never seen before. We came to a door, a big ugly metal thing that opened onto a shadowy corridor that seemed to stretch into the earth. It was lit by a small island of light created by overhead lights in small round cages. As we walked, a chorus of the damned yelled from the doors. They wanted food, they wanted freedom, they wanted death, they wanted to see the sun. We ignored them, and many shrank away when they saw that the warden was with us. We deposited Jameson into one of those cells. He lay on the floor, breathing shallowly, and I paused at the door to look at him. Were we really about to do this? Were we really going to doom a man to spend his days in this dark hole? Would his gift even reach out from this hellish place? As the door swung shut, I both hoped it would and prayed that it wouldn't. That was a month ago, and the prison has never been more peaceful. In the wake of the riot, we returned to the same semblance of peace, much like the days before the quarantine. But I know the truth. I've thought about quitting 1,000 times, thought about putting my gun in my mouth and ending it all, but I always worry that I too might wake up in that lightless void beneath the prison. So let us never forget Officer Jameson, the savior of our compound. May his death come swiftly and release him from the hell he now resides in. May it be enough to grant him the freedom he deserves. My great-grandmother, Sophie Zunie, is easily the most important person in my life. She's seen 118 years and has been through so much in her long life. She was born in Russia, in Moscow actually, in 1904. She was a member of the Russian ballet until she left for America in 1924. She danced and taught ballet once she established herself in America, and now she supports the arts in her old age and helps instructors in getting the most from their dancers. I've been living here since I was 16, my parents having died in a car crash. During that time, I've heard many stories about her life in the New York Ballet, the Chicago Ballet, and her adventures as her troupe toured the New World that was such an enrapturing thing for a young girl fresh from the harsh Russian landscape. Of Russia, though, she would say nothing. She wouldn't talk about her first 20 years of life. It was as if she couldn't bring herself to relive that part of her. No matter how I prodded, she refused to tell me anything. At least, until last night. I woke up around midnight, my bladder bursting. On my way back to bed, I noticed that great-grandmother was sitting in the living room. She had a roaring fire built in the grate, something I was curious about since all the wood was in the backyard, and she was sitting close enough that I was afraid she might go up in flames. I ran in, reaching for the water bucket, but her wrinkled old hand reached out to stop me. "Don't. I like the flames. They remind me of my girlhood." I sat down with her, afraid she might fall in, as she sat and stared at the dancing fire. "They dance as I used to when I was a little girl." I was quiet for a moment, her voice spidery and thin. When you were in Russia?" I finally asked. She nodded. "I studied under Madame Jeunesse Grutiev, one of Russia's finest instructors. She claimed to have performed for the Romanovs in their day, though she never said which Romanovs. She was old when I met her, but she molded my young body into the dancer I am today. Madame Grutiev was responsible for training many great dancers, most going on to dance for the Moscow Ballet. But she was old. People wanted younger dancers to teach their children, teachers who could still demonstrate the techniques without falling on their palsied pec-sides. My mother was no fool, though. She had been trained by Madame Grutiev and wanted her daughter to receive the same training. I went on to dance for her troupe for 16 years, eventually becoming a teacher in her studio. They called me Lady Zunie when I took the stage. I was the darling of the ballet in my season, and my star seemed on the rise. She paused then, her eyes drinking in the flames as she stared it down. Until the fire. She began to tell me her story, and as I watched the flames dancing in her glassy eyes, it seemed like I could see the movie of her life playing out just for me. The studio had a legacy of excellence, but that brought us very little money. Madame Grutiev owed money to some very bad people who didn't like unsettled debts. They had offered trades for more time, wanting her girls for the usual things that brutes want a young girl for, but Madame Grutiev protected us from them. Ah, but these were not the sort of men to be balked. They blocked us from getting work, and Madame Grutiev was getting desperate. She was still making money from the lessons she taught, but her students were also becoming less and less. Some of it was the men she owed money to, but some of it was her age. Parents appreciated a teacher who could demonstrate their craft, and Madame Grutiev was old. Her legs were gouty and unsteady, and her gait was even then not so good. My friend Louise and I did most of the teaching, but we were losing girls to other troops. With these men blocking us from getting work, we had little money to pay the rent on the studio, let alone her debt. But life offers opportunities sometimes, cruel as they may be. Madame Grutiev received an invitation one day. An invitation to take part in Vladimir Stropokov's latest ballet. Stropokov was a genius in Moscow, though his performances were often as experimental as they were outrageous. I remember hearing that one such show had been held in the forest by night, all the dancers performing naked in the snow. Many of them had suffered hypothermia. A few of them had even gotten some frostbite. Still, the show had been heavily attended, and the profits were said to be substantial. Madame Grutiev said that the price he had offered her for 3 dancers would likely pay off her debt, and then some, and Stropokov had asked for Lady Zunie specifically. I've never heard of the performance, but it's highly anticipated and could only raise your star higher. She chose Louise and Georgette to accompany me, her 3 best dancers. We were excited to be in one of Stropokov's shows. They were often odd and sometimes dangerous, but many of those chosen to perform went on to have great success in the Moscow Ballet and beyond. Rehearsals were scheduled for the week to come, and we practiced in our free time so that we wouldn't disappoint Madame Grutiev. We arrived early at the designated practice space, only to find that it was being held at Vladimir Stropokov's estate. We were shown into a large receiving room to wait, several of the girls already present. We spoke with them for a time, the other girls arriving as the appointed time grew closer. Finally, Mr. Stropokov arrived to speak with us personally, and the room grew instantly still. He was dressed in a luxurious dinner coat, a soft pair of pinstripe pants adorning his thick legs, and he looked like a sultan in a children's play. His caliph-like slippers were pointed, elvish in their design and softness, and he seemed to exude charm and affluence.
I am glad that so many of you have come to join my little production. I have called 30 of you here, but will only retain 15. 15 of the best will take part in my production of Moths Aflame. I look forward to seeing what all of you bring to the table, especially the enchanting Lady Zunie.
He winked at me then, seemed to pick me from the crowd, and I felt honored to be noticed by someone so affluent. What a little fool I was. The following 2 weeks encompassed the most demanding audition of my life. Stropokov put us through our paces from dawn till dusk, sometimes making us dance and rehearse for hours on end. He cut 5 in the first hour, 2 others before the day was over. He made us dance naked on the first day, watching us as our bodies moved and making notes of where we could improve. After the 3rd day, we were allowed to wear our leotards, and he made us run through the woods like deer on a hunt. He cut those who didn't run gracefully enough, another 4 girls, and as we bent double, gasping for air in his backyard, he smiled wolfishly.
You do not disappoint, dear Lady Zunie. I knew you would be the one to give my performance fire.
It took 4 more days of grueling drills to ferret out the last 4, and Georgette wept as she was sent away on the last day of trials. After that, the true work began. We were fitted for costumes, the fabric gauzy, and the material slightly oily. It sat against the skin like mud. It made my flesh crawl. It felt greasy, and Louise told me that it made her break out in a rash. As we began to dance in them, I could feel the way it grated against me. It made me think of sandpaper, or maybe burlap, but it was always soft to the touch when I removed it. It makes sense now, but by the time I figured it out, it was far too late. We practiced and rehearsed for the next month, Stropokov's critical eye always upon us. When the night of the show arrived, we were all aflutter with anticipation. We peeked through the curtains as they filed in, women in furs and men in suits. All of them wore mysterious lacquered masks, and they looked ghastly as they leered at the stage. They sat like ghosts amidst the low light, watching with anticipation. In our costumes, we resembled moths. In my stomach, it felt like a swarm was swirling in an anxious cloud. I felt like it was my first time on stage again, and I had to remind myself that this was no different than any other performance. When Stropokov called to us, we gathered for final instruction.
Good luck tonight, my beauties. Tonight's show promises to be the highlight of the season. I am certain that all of your stars will shine brightly this evening.
He smiled hugely, a secret joke that only he understood. Then the curtain came up, and 15 pallid moths began to mount the stage. The stage was circular, rimmed with oil lamps that burned low in their holders. Above us, something hung like a grand chandelier, and as we took our positions, I saw it slowly descend over the top of us. One of the girls, I cannot remember her name, gasped and started to shake as the great something seemed ready to smash us flat. She tried to bolt, but Stropokov's voice cracked like a whip, freezing her in mid-flight.
Do not move a muscle. You will not ruin my vision, little moth. Not tonight.
She squeaked, seeming to be on the verge of tears, and I looked over to see Stropokov with a small gleaming pistol in his hand. As the shadowy mass descended from the ceiling, I saw what it was an instant before it encircled us. It was a glass chimney, like the ones on top of a lantern. The runner, Ingrid, her name was Ingrid, looked enchanted as the milky glass hemmed her in. Her terror had turned to rapture as she looked at the glass prison that now encased us. She stepped shyly towards it, hands outstretched, and when the music started, she missed her cue. The rest of us began to dance, 14 moths in hectic flight. We had been trained to stay within the confines of the stage. A silver circle had been built into the stage just inside the ring of lamps, and it acted as our perimeter. We'd been instructed not to cross that silver ring, but Ingrid was prepared to do just that. It wasn't really her fault. Ingrid was 15, too young to be involved with something like this. She was tough, though. I suppose she had to be to make it this far. She was young, though, and her youth meant that she was still prone to fancy. As we danced, I heard many of them hiss for her to get back into position. We had taken wing, dancing and flapping as we gyrated around our glass prison. As I danced, I saw the eyes of the crowd find us, find me, their Lady Zunie. Stropokov had placed me in the middle of the swarm, giving me a position of prominence. My costume had an eye pattern on the wings, a long flowing stripe that crested the tips, and I stood out amongst my plain white counterparts. As I danced, for the sea of lacquered masks, I could almost imagine them transformed into the rich and affluent men and women of high society that would grace the seats of the Moscow theater, or even the Grand Russian ballroom. I was alone on that stage, dancing my heart out, and the crowd would applaud and cheer and shower me with their praise. I would perform for kings, for lords, just like Madame Grutiev had, and the whole world would know that my star shone above all others. I didn't see when Ingrid stepped too close to the oil lamps, her small hand reaching out to touch the delicate glass. I did not see when her leg set afire as it came in contact with the flame. I saw her when she burst into flames, going up like a real moth when it has kissed the fire within the lamp. Her screams echoed off the glass walls, and the pandemonium erupted soon after. Ingrid ran towards the others, her high angelic voice slipping across our senses like a razor. She ran towards the closest dancer, arms open as she begged to be saved or killed or whatever hope she'd hoped to find there. As they touched, the girl's face an O of surprise. Her costume erupted in flames, and she fell into another. That one lit as well. The two beside her went next, then the two beside her, and so on, and so on. From the center of the dancers, I was trapped in a glowing pyre of flames and screams. It was chaos, girls running and beating at the glass, some still twirling and dancing drunkenly as they burned. I expected the glass to rise. I expected the crowd to come to our aid. But as I watched, I knew this was what they had been waiting for. They were all on their feet now, clapping and cheering as though this were the finest performance they'd ever seen. Stropikov came from backstage, and the applause reached a fever pitch as he raised his hands magnanimously.
Thank you, thank you. Any sacrifice for the sake of art. Any sacrifice for the sake of art!
They were on their feet, their cheers and applause inaudible from inside the dome. They cheered as we died, and I felt certain that this would be the end of me. As the smoke and stench surrounded me, I saw someone in their midst who did not belong. He was tall, taller than a man had any right to be, draped in a ratty black suit and gloves that hung in rags from his two thin fingers. It seemed like I could hear his clapping above the others, the only one I could hear clearly, and as his hands came together one last climactic time, he lifted one of them to his mask. It was different from the others, a grinning fool done in red and black, and as it came away, I saw an equally happy skull beneath. The black eye sockets seemed to wink at me, and the bright white skull grinned merrily. As I lost consciousness amid that hell of running bodies, his was the last thing that I saw. When I awoke, I was laying in the street behind the theater. My clothes had been badly burned. My hair was gone, burned away in the flames, but I was untouched and unhurt so far as I could tell. Several of Stropikov's assistants were moving the bodies from the theater, putting them in the alley behind, and the blackened corpses made me realize how lucky I had been. I was the only survivor of Stropikov's moths aflame. He was never convicted of the 14 girls he burned alive. I know that Madame Grutiev was paid handsomely for her dancers, and I can only assume that the other studios who put forth girls were equally compensated. Before you say that this could not be, that no one would possibly fail to notice 14 missing girls in a city like Moscow, you should remember that this was Russia in the early 20s. World War I had only ended a few years ago, and people disappeared every day. Disappearances were still something not wholly uncommon there. Russia was a hard place to live, even in places like Moscow. People left for better things, People died in strange and horrifying ways. I certainly left when all of this was over. It was not so uncommon to find bodies in the canals and back alleys. I went to Madame Grutiev's studio. When she saw me, she wept. I had no idea he would do such a thing. How was I to know what a monster he was? She gave me the money I had made from the performance, the money that would get her out of debt, and told me to flee. Stropikov has powerful friends, friends who make the ones I owe money to look like minnows to a whale. Take this money, take the money that Louise died for, and build a new life somewhere where things like this do not happen. What about you? I asked her, but she only smiled. I'm going somewhere beyond them. She killed herself later that night, drank poison in her office or some such thing. Georgette found her the next day, but I was on my way elsewhere by then. She found me years later and wrote to tell me these things. She mourned us, those dead and those gone, and told me she still ran the studio where Madame had always loved to be. Stropikov continued to produce shows until 1955. A group of men came to get him after one of his performances, killed 8 girls, and burned a field of wheat to cinder. I think they were probably madder about the wheat than the girls, but they hung him from a nearby tree in the field, and it was too quick for the likes of him, if you ask me. I never danced under Madame Zunie again. She died in Moscow, in the fire that killed so many. We sat there in the ensuing silence, the crackling fire, the only sound other than the shallow respirations of me and my great-grandmother. Did you ever see him again? No, she said, but I never forgot that grinning apparition or the clear regard he had for me. I attribute my long life to that night. I stood before death, and he tipped his head to me. When I see him again, I want him to see that I was worthy of his regard. The two of us sat looking at the fire for quite some time, my sleep forgotten as I watched the cinders dance, becoming ghost moths before my very eyes. I am a murderer. I'm responsible for the deaths of 75 within 2 weeks. I've stabbed men to death, rendered bodies to ash, killed children in the womb, and even drowned whole ships at sea. I've changed the fate of kingdoms and seen to it that uncharted planets remained unfound. I would likely be the most prolific serial killer in the United States, if not for one problem. The police claim that if murdering fictional characters was a crime, they'd have to jail Stephen King and George R. for multiple life sentences. They say this as they laugh me out of the police station. They think it's a joke, or that maybe I'm not right in my head. But I can assure you, I'm as right as I've ever been. I listened to them tell their stories for years, and I've heard them scream when I end their lives. I'm a murderer, pure and simple, and their blood is on my hands. You're probably reading this, though, and thinking that I'm ready for the rubber room. Let me start from the beginning. I've always been a creative mind. When I was younger, I could hear them whisper to me about their homes, their verdant green kingdoms, their sterile, majestic spaceships, the feel of rolling decks beneath their feet, and so much more. It manifested in my games, and my school friends would always gather around to see what today's adventure would be. We traveled the cosmos, fought wars between elves and men, and roamed imaginary prairies as we hunted wrongdoers on horseback. As I grew older, the voices grew louder, more insistent, and their stories became my stories. I wrote about the kingdoms of my youth, the adventures of my childhood, and by the time I was 20, I had 5 books published, even one on the New York Times bestseller list. As I grew, so grew my fame. My writing was prolific, and all the while the voices told me their stories. I took my readers to fantastic places, and their patronage allowed me to live quite well. By the time I was 30, I had a home and a family and enough published work to fill a bookshelf. That's when the problems started. It all started with Aberdeen Price, dashing archaeologist adventure. He told me of his next adventure, a trip to the city of Bone. However, I was working on something else at the time, and didn't want to divert efforts away from my current project. So I wrote some notes and promised myself I would sit down and give him some time when I was done. This apparently wasn't good enough for Aberdeen. He came every night in my dreams and told me his story over and over and over again, until finally, I just couldn't take it anymore. I stopped what I was doing and diverted all my attention to writing his next book. It was a hit, a bestseller, and the biggest mistake of my life. You see, this showed the voices that they could get what they wanted by badgering me. Every night from that night on, they would come to me and tell me their stories, each overlapping the other, until I just couldn't take it anymore. The kingdom of Verdant Green was once at the mercy of the dark wizard Zormuth. His evil armies threatened to... Scanners once more alert Kevin Gorel that he is nearing his destination. The dark planet Zephyr rises from the darkness of space as he see the island of Katmandil off the starboard side of Elizabeth's Folly. The shore is quiet, but Captain Cree can once again see the natives amongst the trees as he hears his quarry. The elusive Dr. Burton will strike again this night, and I will be ready to... Their voices towered in my mind like the screams of children as they tried to make themselves heard. That was my first mental breakdown, and my worst. My wife arrived home in time to save me from bleeding to death. They put me in an institution for 3 weeks after that. Lisa thought it was all the strain of my busy writing schedule. The strain of writing so much must have just become too much for you, she said, as she stood by my bedside and looked down with pity for her poor, brilliant husband. She had no idea. The worst part wasn't the IVs or the sedatives, the shitty TV, or the staying in a room for 24 hours a day, the sounds of sorrow from down the hall, even the constant itching from the healing cuts on my arms. It was the week and a half I spent with my hands in restraints. Without my hands, I couldn't write. Without writing, there was no way to stop the shrieking harpies in my brain from driving me insane. It took me a while to convince them that writing was a kind of therapy for me. The battle was made all the harder by my wife's constant arguments about how the writing had put me here in the first place. After a week and a half of no change, they had begun to see that I might be making some sense. I began to write again, and the changes were noticeable. I started sleeping, became less hostile, finished my meals, and a month later I was ready to go home. The voices started ramping up again almost immediately. By this point in my career, I had 7 stories running on and off. That's a lot of voices trying to be heard. I tried to keep up with them, but I could feel my sanity slipping again as they screamed for my attention day and night. By my 2nd week home, my wife was ready to have me committed all over again. I'd stop sleeping and would lock myself in my study for days to make the voices stop for even a few minutes. That was when my first murder took place. That's not to say that no one had ever died in my stories. Characters die in stories. That's the nature of storytelling. But this was the first time I'd ever deviated from the path set forward by the voices. Detective Sam Umbridge was coming to the climactic end of his latest crime novel, and the shootout with the killer was becoming heated. I had meant to write that Dario West, the antagonist of the novel, was struck by Sam's bullet as he leaned around the doorframe. Before I knew what I'd done, though, I had written the death of beloved gumshoe Sam Umbridge instead. I had moved on to the next sentence before I caught my error, but it was too late by then. He died in my head with a gut-wrenching scream, and just like that, his voice was mercifully silent. For a moment, all the voices were silent. It was as though they had all seen what I had done in my manic state. I cleaned up the draft a little bit before sending it off. Sam and Dario had killed each other in the shootout, and Sam had died victorious. Fans hated that Detective Sam Umbridge would never make another appearance on their shelves, but they accepted it. The end was widely praised by fans and critics alike, an all-around success. My agent even called to congratulate me on the climax of a much-beloved series, and asked if everything was going all right with me. Last time we talked, you sounded as though you were a little shell-shocked. I guess I was in shock now that I think of it. The process really made me think. Why not kill what was driving me crazy? I didn't have to kill them all, just enough of them to make the voices quiet down a little. Like any prolific serial killer will tell you, it's hard to stop once you've started. Before I quite realized what I'd done, I'd ended them all. I ended my 8-book fantasy series with the death of the entire court and the eventual fall of the protagonist in his order. I watched as Kelvin Gorel flew his ship and crew into the phantom night where certain doom awaited, and he would never be heard from again. After sinking the ship of his arch-rival, I had the Spanish Armada sink Elizabeth's Folly with all hands aboard, while Captain Cree floated atop the waves after taking a sword to the belly. I dropped a tomb on the head of Aberdeen Price, the one who had started my descent, and made the ruins he was exploring his own tomb in turn. I killed them all, one by one, and the fans were livid. How could you just kill them? Why wouldn't you simply end the series on a high note? Why did they all have to die? I toyed with the idea of ending their series, but I knew that it wouldn't work the moment I thought of it. They were never my stories in the end. They were only my stories to tell. If I left them alive, they would always want one more adventure. Killing them was all I could do to stop my descent into madness, and as I lay down to sleep that night, I felt myself smile at the thought of my long-awaited sleep. It never came. I've been staring at my sleeping wife for the past 7 hours as I keep court with the whispering dead. Their spirits are unwilling to die, the part of my soul I put inside them reluctant to be put to rest. It's only now that I see the folly of my actions. The dead, you see, are not to be satiated with adventures or the continuing joy of existence. They moan, they wail, they bemoan the lives and the loves that were taken from them. At first, it was only for me that I wept. Now I see that this curse won't end with me. You see, I was watching my daughter as she played in the park yesterday. She played in the sandbox, her dolls and her brother's action figures out on an adventure of her own creation. I watched her going about her games of make-believe as I sat in a daze. When I asked her about it over lunch, she told me a story about knights and castles, people hunting for dragons, and brave warriors protecting those in need from harm. It was a story just like the ones I had made up as a kid. The kingdom was similar to the one I had left in ashes. I beg you, anyone out there who hears the whispers, don't pass the gift to others. It must end with us, and never darken the mind again. I must keep my own vigil now. I must watch my own daughter now, before the madness takes hold. I can't let the whispers have her too, even if it means the death of another of my creations. I won't let the madness have her. She died very suddenly, though none of us could have known what lay inside her. Her name was Kimmy Wynn, and she was from Korea or Singapore, somewhere like that. We never learned much about Kimmy. Her family didn't speak very good English, though, but Kimmy spoke it well enough to understand the lessons. We tried to befriend her, but Kimmy was shy, and I'm ashamed to say that we took to bullying her. We were in elementary school and extremely cliquey. Kimmy was an outsider. She wore strange clothes. She didn't speak like we did, and we made fun of her for it. Most days, she just sat in the back of class, sat on the pavilion at recess, and said little to nothing. When she died, it surprised everyone. Kimmy lived in a small apartment complex in a not-so-great part of town. Her family worked for her uncle, Mr. June, who owned a market in the neighborhood they lived in. Kimmy had been working there after school, helping her parents pay the bills, and she'd been making a delivery on her bike when someone had abducted her. They found her bike just sitting on the curb, wheels spinning slowly, and the police didn't seem hopeful in their investigations. Her kidnapping was all the buzz around school, and my friends wanted to talk about little else. Marissa, our sort of leader, said she bet that Kimmy had just made the whole thing up so that people would be friends with her after she was found. Leanna said that she shouldn't say things like that, but you could tell she didn't really feel very scandalized. She said she'd be praying for her, praying that they'd find her safe, but even at 10, I doubted it. I kept my mouth shut on the matter, personally thinking it was terrible. No one should just be grabbed off their bike as they tried to help their family. A week later, they found her body in an empty lot near her uncle's shop. Mom wouldn't let me watch the news report about it, but Marissa said that the newsman had said that she was chopped into little pieces and left there. The news thinks it might have been something to do with her uncle, but they don't seem to know much about it. A service was held for her at the local Korean Baptist church, and I saw a picture of her parents lighting a little paper boat and floating it out for her. Her 2 sisters, one of whom was in the 1st grade, were there too, and I remember thinking how awful it would be to lose someone like that. My own sister wasn't very nice, but I still didn't want anything like that to happen to her. A few days later, Miss Hurd stopped me as I was going out to recess and asked if I would put the stuff from Kimmy's desk into a box. Her parents are coming at the end of the day, and I really need to be outside with the other children. Just put it on my desk and come outside when you're done. I saw the pack of Marlboros in her hand and guessed that child-minding probably wasn't the only thing on her mind. Marissa stayed to help me, and I found that Kimmy's desk was surprisingly neat. My desk looked like a garage sale, but Kimmy's desk was very organized, and it was easy to pack her stuff away. Marissa cooed over her Hello Kitty pencil box, but I reminded her that we weren't allowed to take her stuff. The pencil box, her notebooks, her folders, and a cute little art supply case went into the box too, along with a Hello Kitty eraser and a pencil set. Marissa looked over it all greedily, but I wasn't trying to get in trouble for taking anything from a dead student, especially not when the teacher had trusted me to pack it. We were loading some of her notebooks when a small purple book fell out of the middle of them. Marissa pounced on it before I could even fully register what it was. I told her to give it back, that it didn't belong to her, but Marissa was already opening it and leafing through it. "Oh, no way! It's her journal! Give it, Marissa. It isn't yours. We need to put it in the box before someone sees it." "No way. No one knows about it, so who's gonna miss it? Unless..." Marissa got a mean look on her face. "You're gonna tattle on me." I stopped complaining then and let her slide the journal into her pocket. Marissa and I had been friends since 1st grade, but I hadn't forgotten how mean she could be either. She had bullied me in kindergarten for the better part of the first half of the year, until I'd come to school with a brand new backpack one day, and she had fallen in love with it. Marissa had said someone with a backpack that cool had to be friends with her and Leanna, and I had been part of their clique ever since. That had only been 3 years ago, though, and I wasn't in a big hurry to go back to the way things had been. Marissa and I were friends, but Marissa could be mean when she wanted to be. I won't tattle," I said softly, more to myself than to her. "Good," she said, snatching the pencil case out before I could get the lid on. I set the box on the desk, and I made sure that Marissa was out of the classroom before I left. I didn't want her doubling back to grab anything else out of there. The idea to make the chatterbox was Marissa's, as so many other bad ideas usually were. She read the journal to us at recess, taking delight every time she or Leanna were mentioned. My name came up a few times, though it was usually by association. It appeared that Kimmy had been keeping a journal of people and how they had wronged her, as well as how they had wronged others. Quite the little spider was Kimmy, hiding away and listening to people as they gossiped or went about their lives. Marissa said, getting a mischievous look. "I've got an idea." She turned to the back and tore out an unused page, beginning to write the predictions for her chatterbox. If you're unfamiliar with the item, it's probably because it has a million names. I've heard them called fortune tellers, whirly birds, paku paku, salt cellars, cootie catchers, and any number of other things. Sometimes when I post about them online, I get little fights started over what they're called. People have 1,000 different names for them, but they seem to be something known worldwide. They are little devices that you put numbers in, picking numbers randomly until you get your fortunes and learn your fate. Marissa had already started writing the same old things she always wrote on the wedges anytime she made one of these. They were never very creative, usually things like you'd marry a millionaire, that you'd be a princess, that you'd have 20 children, that sort of thing. She was always very predictable, but she never seemed to include anything bad in her predictions. Marissa, despite being a bit of a brat, didn't like for bad things to happen to her or her friends. When she made the chatterbox, it was always the best outcomes. Okay, pick a number. I looked at the chatterbox questioningly. What are you doing? Isn't it obvious? If Kimmy knew so many secrets, then maybe she won't mind telling us our future. The idea of using a dead girl's paper to tell our fortunes made me shudder, and I shook my head as she turned to Leanna. Come on, Lee, let me tell your future. I guess it couldn't hurt, Leanna said. 5. Marissa opened and closed the device very fast, before holding out for her to pick another number. 7, she said, smiling a little as the paper creature plopped open and closed very quickly. 3, she finished, and Marissa opened the flap. You should tell Jana what you... But Marissa stopped suddenly. She seemed to realize that she had read words before she had quite put together what they had said. Tell Jana what? Leanna said, smiling but looking a little nervous. Marissa looked at me. Did you write something on this while I wasn't looking? No. When would I have had a chance? Marissa started to call me a liar, but she huffed out a hey as Leanna took the chatterbox and looked at the tab. She looked confused when she got the chatterbox away from her, but she looked angry after she read what was on the tab. You should tell Jana what you did to Mark at the lake. She tossed the little paper thing in Marissa's lap. I told you that in confidence. I only kissed him because you said that I should. Lee, I didn't write that. But Leanna was already storming away, heading for the picnic tables. Marissa looked back at me, holding the paper craft out as though inviting me to take my turn. I don't really want to do it. It feels kind of creepy. Oh my God, Marissa groaned, deep in her throat. Here, I'll do it. She picked numbers at random, moving her fingers very quickly as she selected her fortune. Marissa looked mad, furious even, but that didn't seem to stop her from selecting numbers and finding out what her fortune might be. The fortune that Leanna had read had shocked her, and she was interested in finding the ones that she had written so she could feel okay again. It was a fluke, she must be thinking, and now she was going to prove it. She opened tab number 3, and I could see her hands shaking as she read it. Felicia doesn't like you. She pretended to because her mom asked her to. She looked at me suspiciously, but I just put my hands up and looked at the words inside. It's not even either of our handwritings. Your handwriting is swoopy, and mine is super sloppy. This handwriting is way too neat to be either of ours. Marissa looked at the handwriting, and then flipped open the journal as if looking for the source of it. She stared at a few of the pages before slamming the book shut and taking the chatterbox with her. I asked her where she was going, but she didn't answer. Turns out she was going on a tour of the playground. I didn't realize what was going on until a group of angry kids approached the playground monitor with a frantic Marissa in tow. The lead girl, Felicia Spaulding, looked livid, and Marissa was trying to tell her how sorry she was with every step she took. Miss Conway, Marissa's telling lies about my friends and me. Miss Conway, a broad, beefy, grandmotherly woman with hands like slabs of meat, looked at Marissa and then back to Felicia. What's going on, girls? What's this about lies? I didn't write it, Marissa wailed, waving the chatterbox with her free hand. She wrote lies about us in her chatterbox. Her box said that my mom had gotten an abortion and that Cindy was adopted. Cindy, the tall girl with the wavy brown hair that hung with Felicia in her clique, was crying and shaking her head. Other kids had similar stories. Some said that her chatterbox had told them that their parents were getting divorced. Others said that it had said it knew things that they had done or things they had said. One of them even claimed that it told him that his aunt would die later that week and that she was in the hospital with cancer. Marissa, hand that thing over, Miss Conway said, her face growing dour as she listened to the long list of complaints against Marissa. Marissa gave her the folded paper, both hesitant and loath to be rid of it, and she almost cried out in anguish as Miss Conway tore it into pieces. Next time I hear of something like this, I'll give you after-school detention. Stop writing lies about people, and the rest of you go play. They all dispersed, Marissa looking down at the pieces of the chatterbox as they drifted in the wind. I hadn't walked up with the rest, but I was still close enough to hear Felicia tell her not to expect to go to any of her parties anymore. Marissa changed after that, and it seemed to me that the chatterbox was the reason for it. For the rest of the day, she just sat at her desk and looked down at her lap. I couldn't see what she was fiddling with at first, but eventually I saw it was another one of the chatterboxes. I was shocked. Hadn't she learned her lesson after the first one? Her book was open, but her hands moved below the lip of the desk in a rapid series of jerks and swoops. She would flick it once, twice, 3 times before opening the corresponding flap and reading what it said. Every answer seemed to make her more and more agitated. She would take it off her hands sometimes and seemed on the verge of ripping it to shreds before gently sliding it back on and starting again. "Marissa, would you care to answer number 4 for us?" Miss Hurd asked, drawing my attention back to the front of the class and drawing Marissa out of her stupor. Marissa shoved the chatterbox under her desk and looked down at her open textbook as she searched for number 4. 17? Miss Hurd blinked. "That would be correct if we were still on our math lesson. We've moved on to geography. Are you feeling well, Marissa? You don't seem like yourself today." Marissa turned beet red, digging through her desk to find her book. Miss Hurd had approached her desk, I suppose wanting to see if she might be feverish, and when she stooped to pick something up, I saw that the chatterbox had tumbled out of her desk as Marissa looked for her book. "Oh, what have we here? I remember these from when I was a little girl. We used to use them to tell each other's fortunes. I can't believe kids still make these for..." But as she had been talking, she had opened one of the flaps on the chatterbox. She glanced at the tab as it came fully open, and her words ended as abruptly as they had begun. Marissa looked up at her as her geography book came open, and the look on her face was enough to tell me that she didn't like what she saw there. "Get up," Miss Hurd whispered, her voice barely containing her rage. Miss Hurd?" Marissa asked, unsure what was happening. "Get your..." She curbed her next words. "Things, and come with me. We're going straight to the principal's office, young lady." Marissa looked up, confused, but collected her things and went with Miss Hurd to the office. She never came back to class, and when I asked Miss Hurd, she only told me that her mother had been called after something she had written in the chatterbox. Marissa was suspended for 5 days. She was taken out of class and put in another 4th grade class, away from Leanna and I. Leanna said it served her right for writing lies about people. She made her bed, and now she has to sleep in it. I would have honestly forgiven her, but not after what she said about Miss Hurd. I asked her what she had said, and Leanna leaned in like it was some big secret. "I heard that she had written that Miss Hurd was cheating on her husband with Mr. Sizemore." "The PE teacher? Yeah, can you imagine? She's lucky she didn't get expelled." When Marissa came back to school, she was a very different girl. She looked frazzled, her red hair looking unkempt. She seemed to be constantly pulling at her clothes. She was nervous and twitchy, and she seemed obsessed with the little chatterbox. She would ask people to pick a space, ask them to make a choice, but most people would just walk past her without speaking. It's tough to be labeled a social pariah at 10 years old. She had lost all of her friends, except for me, and I wasn't even sure I still wanted to be her friend. When I saw her at recess that day, sitting by the fence and fiddling with the chatterbox, I sat beside her and asked if she was okay. I could smell a smell around her, and it wasn't an altogether healthy smell. "I can't let her beat me," she whispered, her face very close to the chatterbox as she worked the mechanism. "Who?" I asked. "Kimmy," she said, just as low, and when she opened the fold on the chatterbox, she sobbed and closed it again before starting. "Mara, Kimmy's dead," I said, using her nickname to try to bring her back to her senses. "Not all the way dead," she said, and when she opened the tab this time, her fingers crumpled the space, and I could read the message written there just before she closed it. "Your mother thinks you're crazy." Marissa pushed me suddenly, and the fence scratched my back as I slid sideways. Through the tears that welled in my eyes, I could see her lunatic's face as she pushed it inches from mine. "That's not your fortune. Don't read other people's fortunes." Miss Conway must have seen something, because she started walking over. I got up and walked away quickly, not looking at Marissa as the playground monitor approached her. That was the last time I spoke to Marissa, but not the last time I saw her. For the next 3 months, I saw her on and off. She became like a wraith who haunted the school. She stopped asking people to look at the chatterbox. She just sat off by herself and played with it, cringing and sobbing every time she opened a flap. The more I saw her, the worse I felt for her, and eventually I decided to try and bury the hatchet. I decided that after school I would go visit her at home and try to see if we could reconcile. I also wanted to see if there was any sanity left in her to save. She hadn't been at school the last couple of days, not that anyone but me had bothered to notice. When I arrived at her house, her mother seemed happy to see me. She told me that Marissa had been feeling poorly lately, and that maybe a friend might cheer her up. Marissa's mother looked like she hadn't slept in a few days, and even at 10, I noticed that she approached Marissa's room like there might be a wild animal behind the door. She knocked, slow and hesitant, and told Marissa that I was here to see her. Marissa said nothing. She knocked again, asking if Marissa was awake. Marissa said nothing. Her mother opened the door slowly, and I could see Marissa sitting at the desk with her back to the door. She never moved when her mother walked over to her, and as I stood in the doorway, I couldn't help but take in what appeared to be the lair of a crazy person. Some of the details would come to me afterward, but many of them were seen in the split second that we often use to see details and assess if a person is a threat or not. The floor was full of chatterboxes, like a flower bed of folded paper, and her mother seemed to be stepping over them gingerly. The outside of them were covered with words, all of them written in that neat, spidery handwriting. The writing on the wall was all Marissa's, though. She had written on the wall in anything she could find. The scrawls were a messy jumble of pen, pencil, paint, charcoal, and even rusty red colors that might have been her own blood in a few places. The words were strange, not making a lot of sense. She watches. She whispers. She tells me, I'm crazy. I'm insane. I'm a disappointment. She haunts me. Most chilling of all was the rusty red smear of the word Kimmy over the head of her bed, like she had traced it with a bleeding finger. When her mother started to scream, I was turned away from the bloody words as if someone had slapped me. She was screaming Marissa's name again and again, shaking the ragged scarecrow that she had become. She begged me to dial 911, and I ran downstairs to do just that. The paramedics couldn't figure it out. They said it was like her heart had just stopped, and no amount of CPR or defibrillation could bring her back. As they laid her out on the ground, I could see her face frozen in a rictus of fear and shock. Looking to the desk, I saw the chatterbox she had been toting around. It was grimy, covered in fingerprints, but I believe to this day that it was the same one that Miss Conway had destroyed all those weeks ago. The open flap was blank, the surface stark and unmarred. I can't imagine what she could have read there, and I honestly didn't want to find out. I'm in high school now. 8 years have passed, but I still remember the lesson I learned from Marissa. It's unwise to mess around with the possessions of the dead. Their things are better left undisturbed, their memories left unread. It was the last lesson Marissa would ever learn, and she learned it too late. If it's a lesson I ever forget, I have a reminder on my desk every day. You see, when I came home from Marissa's funeral, the chatterbox was sitting on my doorstep. I can't prove it was the same one. I know that it can't be the same one, but that didn't stop me from scooping it up and putting it in my pocket before my mother could see it. I heard it whisper to me that night. Its whispering is little more than a mutter as I sit here writing. It's harder to hear, but it never goes away. That's why I refuse to touch it, let alone use it. Let Marissa and Kimmy keep each other company inside that thing for the rest of time, for all I care. I don't want the knowledge they hold that badly. The room was dark, the smoke clouds wafting up to obscure the overheads that made the man's shiny face all the more noticeable. He was sweating heavily, stammering out the last few minutes of his set as he told the crowd about an incident with his mother when he was 12. The audience, stoners, hipsters who've been drinking since noon, watched him like a bug under a microscope. They wanted to be interested in what he was saying, but really, they were just hoping he would burn up in the harsh overhead lights. At the end of the day, there's nothing better than watching a comedian crash spectacularly. I took a swig of my lukewarm beer and made notes in my notebook. I'd been doing comedy for about a year, and doing comedy is a lot like Alcoholics Anonymous. The guys who have been doing it longer than you are always super smug about it, and they have 1,000 different sayings. They just tell you to keep working the program, no matter how much you hate it. In this case, the program was a 15-minute set. Randy, a 5-year vet of the stage, had found me doing stand-up at my college. He said I had some chops, but suggested that I work on my 15-minute set until I knew it backwards and forwards. Once you know that set better than you know your own hand, then you can start adding new stuff. 6 months later, I'd been doing the same set for 6 months without fail. I felt that I knew it well. I could have quoted it in my sleep, and I had tried to add some new material from time to time. The bits were snappy, the one-liners were delivered perfectly, and Randy had even said that some of my new stuff was good, though off script. I felt that my bits were topical, without being inflammatory, and that my stories landed without being too long-winded. I wasn't ready for Comedy Central, but I was more than prepared for the little dive bars that seemed to be where I was cutting my teeth. So, why was I only receiving middling laughs? The guy on stage, I hadn't bothered to learn his name, stumbled off the stage to some polite, if not strained, applause. He flopped onto the couch next to me, wiping the sweat off his forehead. Randy took the mic and started attempting to get the crowd excited for the next comedian. Randy was usually the MC of these events. His reputation had been made over a half a decade of funny, and the crowd was always glad to see him. He was building me up, getting the crowd hyped for my set, and as he introduced me, I stood up to scattered applause and made my way to the stage. I mounted the stage, a beer in one hand and my notebook in the other, and I set up for the crowd as they murmured and coughed. I adjusted the mic, dropping it a little from Randy's 7-foot-tall height, and the audience seemed to find this amusing. I could see many familiar faces sitting amongst the smoke, and smelled the cheap beer aroma of whatever was on tap. The audience was almost always the same barflies and regulars who came to hear the same jokes repeatedly. I was always happy to see them, and their tip money at the end of the night, but I remember wishing for some new blood amongst the spattering of drunks and stoners. Oh, how God mocked me with his answer. So I'm pro-gun, hold your booze. A few half-hearted boos came from the crowd as though in answer. Someone online asked me the other day if that meant I would shoot a home invader, which it does, but as a comedian who works for tips, I don't usually have anything worth stealing, so it's not usually a problem. Some scattered laughs followed this. Well, they always followed up by asking, "What, don't you value human life more than things?" Well, I tell them, clearly he valued my things more than his life, so I must have nicer shit than I thought. Some half-hearted laughs greeted the end of my joke, but they were perfunctory at best. The crowd came in just as I was setting up the next joke. Have you heard of this guy that makes paper out of elephant dung? Yeah, I shit you not. They take the dung, clean it, press it, clean it again, I hope, and, through a process known only to the paper maker, they create an eco-friendly paper that's safe for the environment. The crowd shuffled in as I set up my punchline, and though I couldn't tell exactly how many there were, it looked like at least 20 people as they filed into the back of the room. I couldn't tell if they sat down or not. The room seemed to get darker as they filled the space. They didn't fill in the empty spaces left by the sparse crowd. They just kind of hovered near the back of the room, in a cloud of strange silence. I realized I had paused a moment too long and was stretching my punchline out before I continued. But it's like they say, isn't it? One elephant's crap is another man's 50 Shades of Grey. The crowd actually laughed at that one. This joke was so ridiculous that it never failed to get laughs. The group in the back, however, burst into sudden and immediate laughter. The laughter was welcome, but a little unexpected. It was hearty, almost manufactured, and it rolled out in a jolly wave that seemed to take some people by surprise. I saw people in the front jump a little as 20 or so people burst into spontaneous laughter, and I smiled a little, nodding and asking if they liked that joke or something, before continuing on with my next one. crowd of newcomers were definitely what we needed around here, and I rode the wave of their laughter into my next bit. You ever wonder why you never see any hipster necrophiliacs? The front row shook their head, but the back continued to laugh mechanically, 'cause they'd have to screw 'em before they get cool. The laughs from the front were more akin to groans as they accepted the corny joke, but the back of the house burst into the same mechanical laughter they had before. I was energized. I was pumped. I was receiving what I thought was my due at long last. These people were eating up what I was putting down, and it tempted me to do something I'd been working on, but just hadn't brought out yet. So my mom called the other day, and the crowd in the back hadn't stopped laughing, though. They buzzed with this sort of constant canned laughter as the others died down and waited for the next joke. Some had turned to look at the crowd behind them, and I could see some of the other comedians looking at them with misgivings. Their laughter never changed, never rose or fell in volume, but kept chuckling out in that fake sitcom laughter you always hear on Friends or How I Met Your Mother. She lives in a small town, 2 stoplights and a Walmart, and the town has a dog that's become a sort of... I was starting to lose my focus as the crowd kept laughing. They never tired, never stopped, and I could see one of the comedians getting up to say something. The audience wasn't watching me anymore. They were all craning around in their seats, looking at the crowd that chuckled on and on. The comedian, it was Mark for sure, walked towards the back. As he did, he was suddenly obscured by the smoky darkness that seemed unaffected by the murky overheads that flanked the stage. He stopped on the fringes, saying something to them as they laughed in response. He suddenly clapped his knees and began to bray that donkey laughter I had heard from the stage on many occasions. He laughed long and hard, joining the throng as his brays were lost amongst the grating mirth. After a few seconds, his unique sound was lost amongst their glee. Town mascot, I continued as I tried to power through it. It sleeps in the middle of the road. People feed it and leave it water. They drive around it and bring it inside at night, and everybody knows who he is and why he's there. I was losing focus. I could see Randy approaching the stage, plugging in a mic so he could remind the crowd to keep it down and respect the comedians. And I hoped that this was just some kind of prank. The laughter had been going for nearly 2 minutes now, and it was becoming abrasive. It was no longer flattering. I was no longer heartened by the laughter. I was becoming creeped out, and if this was someone's idea of a joke, it wasn't very funny. I heard the static when Randy's mic slipped in. Okay, people, let's remember to respect the comedians and keep our laughter to a respectable level, okay? The laughter continued, uninterrupted. I stood on the raised stage, looking out into the inky blackness and watching the chuckling tide. They rumbled out their artificial laughter in the face of my confusion, Randy standing by the stage, glaring at them. When he sat the mic down, I could hear the reverb as it made an angry sound. He set off for the back of the house then, not a particularly long walk, but he didn't seem to want to make it. When he got to the throng of people, he started shouting at them to be quiet. Randy had come to the same conclusion I had. He thought this was a big joke, a flash mob, or maybe even something set up by Mark, and he was not amused. I watched from the stage as his shouts became confused chuckles, his chuckles becoming guffaws, and then it was all over for poor Randy. He stumbled into the mob, grinning and laughing, and his laughs were soon consumed by that tide of laughter. That's when they started moving forward. The crowd was up now, scenting danger, but the strange group blocked the exit. They could do little but watch as the shuffling mass crept forward. They seemed to float as they came, sweeping slowly towards the crowd that had congregated near the stage. Some drunk let fly with a pitcher of PBR, the pitcher spilling as it flew end over end. But if the crowd was slowed by the beer or the heavy glass vessel, they didn't show it. Other men charged them, meaty fists raised, but fell to their knees, laughing before connecting with anything. The group rolled over them, and when they passed, there was no longer anyone on the ground. The closer they got, the less I felt like I saw any of them. As the barflies began to chuckle, their knees shaking and their fists pounding their chests, the more my feet began to drive me towards the back of the stage. The group was made of human-shaped creatures. Their features were dark and undulating, their mouths laughing, white teeth smiling, as their eyeless faces bobbed with mirthless laughter. Those who were absorbed by them were never seen again. Those who were absorbed by them never stopped laughing. When my back smacked against the wall, I knew I was out of places to retreat. The fabric curtain that covered that wall felt soft under my sweaty hands, and it was only then that I realized I was still holding the mic. I let it drop, the feedback yarking angrily, but I hardly noticed amidst the din of emotionless laughter. The tone never rose, never fell, just remained at the same level of soulless noise as it drove ice picks into my skull. I closed my eyes, sinking to my backside and covering my ears with my hands as the mass came up to the edge of the stage. When the overhead light hit it, the mass recoiled, and the laughter sounded like tortured screams with a thin veneer of hilarity. It sounded like the laughter that comes creeping out of the windows of an insane asylum. It sounded like the laughter one hears in hell. I closed my eyes and prepared to be consumed. I knew that I, too, would begin to laugh any minute. I would be hopeless to resist. I would simply start to chuckle, start to guffaw, and before I knew it, I would be running to them. I would gladly join the throngs of laughing fools if it meant an end to this hell. I was standing alone outside the joke, and even now in my terror, I longed to be part of it. I don't know how long I sat there with my hands over my ears. One minute the world was a sea of robotic laughter. The next, it was simply gone. I lifted my head to find the bar's back room completely empty. The other three comedians, Mark, Randy, the audience, they were all gone. I was the only one left, the only one not laughing. And when I left the bar, the owner watched me go with some confusion. I never came back again. I knew I couldn't stand on that stage, not after what I had seen, and I certainly couldn't tell jokes again as I thought about the grinning audience of living darkness. Turns out, that was the first of many retreats that night. Over the next few weeks, I saw the audience again and again. They were in the grocery store as I checked out. They were outside the bus as I rode it to work, standing outside the bus stop and looking at me with their eyeless faces. The night they were at the foot of my bed, I knew I had to leave. I packed up everything that mattered to me, got in my car, and drove until I ran out of miles or ran out of money. Turns out, the money came first. I ran out of gas next to a little motel that needed a desk clerk. I've been handling that desk for the last 2 years. I'm pretty good at my job. I make the guests laugh. I'm always at work on time since I live on the premises, and I can eat anything I want from the hotel kitchen as long as I don't go too crazy. I found friends in this little town. Not the same as the ones I had, but they're good people. They tell me often that I should be a comedian. I tell them that in another life, I was. When I go to sleep, I get to live that other life and listen to the chuckling crowd as it drags itself closer and closer to my stage. I always wake up before they get me. I hope they never do. I'm not proud of it, but when you receive one of those calls about your car's extended warranty, it's sometimes me. I'm a writer, a published writer, with an agent, a bestseller, and everything. 5 years ago, I was number 3 on several bestseller lists. 5 years ago, Oprah featured my book on her book list. 5 years ago, I sat on Ellen DeGeneres and promoted the crap out of my book, a move that netted me the house I now live in. It was a good year for me, and when my agent suggested that I write a sequel, I jumped at the chance. 5 years later, my sequel is finally coming together, but the bills don't stop just because your royalties and your residuals stop rolling in. My wife went back to her job at the grocery store, something to help pay the bills while I was working on my book, but it just wasn't enough. We had lived a little too grandly for the last 4 years, and now the money was gone. I told her I was paying the bills out of the residuals, but in reality, it was the salary I made working call center jobs like this one. Call center jobs are pretty easy, all things considered. You read a script, you call gullible people and offer them goods and services. You rake in little bonuses when you manage to trick the old or the infirm. It also allows me to work from home so I can proofread pages and research chapters while I cold call people in my pajamas. You get a lot of hate, a lot of people playing games, but that kind of thing is easy to ignore. Hell, I did retail for 8 years when I was young, and it's given me a pretty thick skin. It was easy to ignore when you realized that whether you made the sale or not, you were still going to receive a check at the end of the week. It was a pretty good gig, until I cold called someone I shouldn't have. The voice that picked up the phone was deep, cultured, and I should have known that it wasn't a voice of someone that could be fooled with such a cheap trick. He was the last number on my sheet for the day, and I figured I had nothing to lose. "Yes, sir, I'm calling you about your car's extended warranty. Do you still own the 2013 Link? Does this ever actually work?" I stumbled for a moment, choosing to roll on with the script rather than break character. "Lincoln, the warranty is nearing its expiration, and we're offering select customers a... This is the 5th call I've received from your company today, young man." I started to ignore it, like I'd ignored the others, but I figured I'd pick up this time and see what was so important. I see now that the answer was nothing. I tried to stay in character, but it was hard in the face of his frank honesty. "Look, I'm just doing my job, sir. I've got bills to pay and a family to feed, same as you. If you aren't interested, then I'll..." "Oh, a family man! Is that why you take the elderly for their pensions and scam the mentally handicapped for their hard-earned money? Such a provider. I'm sure your children would be proud of their father." He said it in such a matter-of-fact way that I almost didn't register it as an insult. I could have hung up on him. He wasn't the worst offender I'd had all day. But something about his voice rankled me. Where did this guy get off? He was going to sit here and tell me how rotten it was to make my money this way, like I didn't already know? Where the heck did he get off? "Look, buddy, there's no reason for any of that. We're just calling to let you know about your warranty program. If you don't want it, then I'll just..." He cut me off again. "Don't worry about it, friend. I'm sure you'll have more prevalent things to worry about soon enough. Ciao." The line went dead then, and the silence seemed ominous. I sat the phone down like I thought it might blow up. I'd been threatened on the phone before, but this one felt different. There'd been no screaming, no cursing, no invitations to screw myself, or questions about how I slept at night. I shuddered a little, suddenly feeling like a goose had walked over my grave. I jumped a little when I saw my son standing in the doorway, scratching his neck. Michael had wandered into my office while I was on the phone. I turned to him as he stood scratching, his hand moving up and down his back, before asking if he was okay. He'd been napping, something he would have to give up when he started school next year, and it seemed that his itchy back had woken him slightly ahead of schedule. "Daddy, my back is so itchy." I told him to go lay in bed while I grabbed the cream and the lotion. His mother and I called it Triceratops cream, something that always made Michael laugh, and it seemed to be the only thing that helped with his eczema when it got really bad. It's something he's suffered with since he was very young. We've had to wash his clothes with dye-free detergent, use special soap during his baths, and stay far away from things like wool. So I grabbed the cream and the lotion so I could lather him up and bring his itching to an end. As I slid his shirt off, however, I worried there might be something else going on here. Michael's back was covered in boils. A swath of small pustules with white heads were scattered over his pink skin, and they looked like pimples. There were clusters of small patches, islands of blight on a sea of normal skin, and I was honestly a little afraid to touch them. Nevertheless, I mixed the cream together and rubbed them onto his back, feeling him jump as some of the boils burst beneath my fingers. He seemed to relax when I finished, thanking me as he slid his shirt down gingerly. That was how it started. I wish I could say that was where it ended. I was proofing pages when my daughter, Michelle, arrived home from school. She stumbled into my office, her hands scratching at the back of her neck absent-mindedly, as she hugged me and told me about her day. We'd done this ever since her first day of school, and it was one of her daily rituals. She'd taken a test she believed she'd done well on, found $1 in the storm grate near the house, and told Jenny that she was being mean to Sarah, so the two were no longer friends. I listened to her in a detached way, nodding and mm-hmming as she talked, noticing her scratching her neck a couple of times. The scratching didn't seem peculiar. People scratch sometimes, but I couldn't help but notice the red patch of skin on the back of her neck as she left to go start her homework. I turned back to my work, but sighed as I noticed the time. I saved my work and locked my computer. I had hardly gotten through half the chapter I was working on, but it was time to get started on dinner before my wife got home. The pork chops were cooking in the air fryer when my wife came through the door. I smiled as I turned to pull her against me, kissing the top of her head as she leaned warmly into me. She shuddered a little as my hands touched her back, but said it was just some back pain from standing all day. Mary called out again, so I was the only one working the register. Again. It was 8 straight hours of standing behind the register, listening to people complain. How'd your book proofing go today? I turned away from her, pretending to stir the potatoes as I answered. Stephanie could always tell when I was lying. Pretty good. Lots of progress. I'm sure it'll be ready for my agent in a few weeks. That's fantastic, dear. I'm sure it will be as much of a hit as your last one, she said, pressing a kiss on my stubbly cheek. I smiled, but I really wasn't so sure. It all came down to this latest book, it seemed. I just had to finish my book. I just had to write another hit. I just had to find my way back onto the bestseller list and get myself out of Dutch. Easy, right? The next morning I awoke determined to get some work done today. I would make up for my lack of work the day before and end with some real progress. I still had over 200 pages to proof, and if I didn't get them done fairly quickly, there would be no time to send them off, and quite likely I'd have to sit through notes on a second draft. As I went to wake my daughter up for school, however, I heard the hoarse cough coming from my son's room. I cracked the door to find him lying on his stomach, his shirt off and his back worse than the day before. His skin was broken out in red, angry boils, and the small white-headed blemishes of the day before had become larger and redder, their tips filled with translucent pus. He was softly moaning, his eyes begging for me to make the pain stop as they pulsated. My wife came out of the bedroom then, getting ready for work, and saw Michael's back. She ran to him, careful not to touch any of the spots, and asked me if he'd had these since yesterday. He was broken out, I said honestly, startled by the sudden appearance of the large angry boils, but it wasn't this bad. I put on lotion and cream, and he seemed to feel a lot better. Stephanie started talking quietly to herself, mostly arguing with herself about whether she could find someone to cover for her, but I told her I could take Michael to the pediatrician. Heck, what was the point of being a stay-at-home husband if I couldn't take my son to the doctor? She asked if I was sure. She knew I had work to do today, but I told her that it was nothing. I told her to go to work and that I would handle things here. I told Michael to stay in bed, not wanting him to aggravate any of the blisters he had on his back, and went to go wake Michelle up so she didn't miss her bus. I was in for another surprise when I got to her room. I opened her door and was immediately buffeted by the sound of her racking cough and her low groans from the bed. She was warm to the touch, not overly so, but definitely fevered, and I asked how she was feeling. She said it felt like she had the flu. Her throat hurt, she was hot, and her whole body ached. My wife was getting ready by then, stepping into the shower before she stepped into her uniform, and I figured it would be just as easy to make an appointment for 2 kids as it would for 1. I told Michelle to get some clothes on, and that I would make an appointment for her and Michael. With all the COVID paranoia still floating around, it was pretty easy to get an appointment last minute with the symptoms they were presenting. 1 phone call to an after-hours nurse later, and I prepared to trade all my editing and proofreading time before work for time spent sitting in the car until it was our turn to go to the back. It was an hour and a half before we made it in, and I tried to make the most of it by doing some edits on my phone. It was slow and tedious, the 2 of them glued to their phones or their gadgets in the back seat as they hacked and coughed, but I managed to get a little bit of work done before they sent me a text saying they were ready for us in the back. 30 minutes later, their pediatrician came back with very little by way of an explanation. Well, they don't have COVID, or the flu, or anything else that I can test for here. What they do have is a high fever, a very wet cough, and troubling boils all over their back. Michelle too, I asked, having not been aware that she was sporting boils as well. Michelle too, she confirmed. Her outbreak isn't as bad as Michael's, but it's getting worse. I'd recommend that you keep them at home until it clears up. Don't touch the sores with your bare hands, and if you happen to by accident, be sure to disinfect your hands with alcohol. Wear gloves and a mask when you interact with them, and go to the hospital if you or your wife start presenting symptoms. I'm hoping it clears up on its own, but if it doesn't in a day or 2, you should take them to the hospital anyway. I bundled them back into the car, a handful of prescriptions in my pocket, and called my wife as I went about getting their medications and getting them home. All of this, the meds, the visit, everything, was going to cost some, and I needed to get them settled so I could log some hours at work. My wife's insurance wasn't very good, and the money I made would be crucial if I wanted to get out of debt. I also had to find some time to work on my book, knowing in the back of my mind that it was the secret to solving my current problems. Stephanie picked up on the third ring, and the cough she rumbled into the phone sounded suspiciously like the ones from the back seat. She swore it was just allergies, and commiserated with me about the diagnosis. She wished she could be there, but said that she would likely be late this evening. Mary had called out, again, and she was the only one working register today. It was noon before I got everyone medicated, set up in their rooms with lunch and toys and entertainment, and sat down at my computer so I could begin my day. As I took calls and proofed pages, I felt a little bubble of anxiety every time someone picked up the phone. I was still a little rattled by yesterday's call, but all of my calls today seemed normal enough. I actually had 2 people give me their information and buy one of the garbage warranties we offered. I had no idea whether they worked or not, but the company was paying me to make calls, not research their products. In between calls, I peeked in on the kids to make sure they were okay. Michael spent most of the day sleeping, his breath heavy and wet, and Michelle just looked at me whenever I peeked in on her, seeming listless and barely there. I gave them more meds and made sure they had juice and liquids, and kept an eye on their temperatures as I took calls in between my nursing duties. As the sun set, I began to get worried about my wife. She should have been home by now, should have been home a half an hour ago, and I was just about to call her when I heard the door pop loudly open. She was laid out on the floor of the living room, her coughs deep and wet, her own blemishes peeking from the collar of her work shirt. I took them all to the hospital then, just bundled them into the car and went. The ER didn't know what to make of them, but we've all been quarantined upstairs now as I try to figure out why I haven't gotten sick with the same symptoms as the rest of my family. They are working hard to manage their fevers. All 3 of them are around 103, and they're laid out on their stomachs as their boils have become very fragile. They're afraid that popping them might lead to sepsis, but the longer I look at them, the more intrigued by them I become. I've been sitting in the room for the last few hours, my only company the beeping of their machines, and as I sat next to my wife, I noticed something strange. The boils on her back seemed to be forming a pattern, the swoops almost looking like a picture. I sat stroking her hand, Stephanie groaning in and out of consciousness, and the longer I looked, the more I realized the swoops are words. Moving over to Michael, I can see he has similar words, all picked out in the pustulant boils that mark his baby-fine skin. I brought my phone out and snapped pictures of their backs, the 3 of them requiring a little turning and moving before the messages were visible. I'm sitting here now as I contemplate telling the doctor what I've found. I don't think it'll help, but I don't know what to make of it either. It can't be what I believe it is, but I can't think of any other explanation for the words that I'm reading swirled across the painful backs of my family. The message reads, "I've been trying to reach you about your car's extended warranty." When I was a kid, I had a pretty typical suburban childhood. White picket fences, ticky-tacky suburban houses, endless concrete for my friends and I to ride our bikes on, and the only strangers we saw were the occasional drifters or travelers that wandered through our town. My dad worked at the steel mill. My mom was a homemaker. I remember afternoons off from school filled with bike rides and trips to the arcade, Boy Scout meetings, and exploring Stokes Woods that lay just off the secluded neighborhood we all lived in. Stokes Woods was where my friends and I had so many firsts. It was honestly the first bit of real freedom we had. We spent summer days exploring, making maps and setting up camps that would be found later to our great amusement. It was our first brush with death, too, finding birds or animal carcasses on the trail. We poked at them with sticks and oohed at the bugs that crawled out. We never guessed that one day we might share their fate. I was in the woods the first time I swore, yelling, "Damn it!" as I skinned my knee when I was 8. I was in those woods the first time I saw a naked lady, the glossy pages of Terry's dad's Playboy gripped in my sweaty hand as we sat around the campfire when we were 11. It hosted my first camping trip. It was the first place I was allowed to camp alone. Well, with Terry and Reggie, but it was our first time out alone at night. It was also where we found the treehouse. The treehouse was a relic of kids gone by. It was in a big old tree set into a clearing, a fire pit dug in its shadow. It had a dumbwaiter to pull things up, and a rope ladder to climb up through a trapdoor. It was built in pieces, There was a wall inside with the signatures of kids who had added to it, complete with dates when they had completed them. When we came across it one afternoon, our 9-year-old eyes grew big with wonder. We knew we had found something special that day. Over the next few weeks, we replaced the rope ladder, cleaned out the fire pit, and replaced the dumbwaiter rope. We painted it too, finding some paint at the junkyard and painting the faded treasure in a wash of purple and brown and gold. We added a bike rack, again with the wood from the junkyard, and signed our names and dates on the wall when the project was done. The easy trip to and from the junkyard made me believe that the treehouse might have been constructed from the things they found there. We asked Old Man Macy, the caretaker, and he said that kids had been coming and going from the dump for years. He said every few years some kids would come along and take wood and pipes and things for special projects they did out in the woods. He was honestly glad they had been putting it to good use. We'd been playing and camping and using the treehouse for a couple of years when Terry suggested a Halloween sleepover. It's on a Friday. We can camp out in the treehouse and eat candy and tell scary stories. I thought it sounded like a great idea, and my parents agreed. 3 kids alone in the woods may seem weird to some of you, but the town we lived in was pretty rural. Our town had a population of about 1,200, and crime was almost non-existent. Besides the odd traveler that sometimes blew through, you knew your neighbors pretty well. We had camped in the woods for the last 2 years, and the Boy Scouts had taught all of us how to camp safely and not burn down the woods. That night, we all hit the street as soon as the lamps came on. We set out with our pillowcases in hand and embarked on a sweet journey to collect the most candy. As always, we had a theme, and we were all dressed as the Avengers when we went out trick-or-treating. I was Hawkeye, bow slung over my shoulder, handmade costume and cheap mask covering my eyes. Reggie was the Hulk, body painted green and absurd rubber hands over his real ones. Terry was Captain America, his store-bought costume topped off by a trash can lid that he had painted a star on. We moved from house to house, striking poses and delighting adults as they filled our pillowcases with candy. By the time the porch lights started going out, we had bulging sacks ready to burst from all the candy we'd gotten. We stopped at our homes, dropping off a little excess candy and getting our camping stuff. We told our parents where we were going, and my mom kissed me goodnight and told me to come straight home if there was an emergency. And with that, we set off. We walked the familiar trails into the woods. Our backpacks were bulging with our candy sacks, and the night was lit by a full and ghostly moon. Terry and Reggie talked excitedly about the candy, wanting to tell ghost stories as we ate it. But I kept getting distracted. I could swear there was a noise out in the woods, a bird or a high-pitched wind. As we moved towards the treehouse, it seemed to follow us. The other 2 were oblivious, but the sounds made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It came closer and closer, never quite reaching us, but seeming to pass us sometimes. I heard it behind us, heard it in front of us, and how the others could remain oblivious of it was beyond me. When the treehouse rose up to greet us, it was a real relief. In the light of the full moon, though, it looked ghostly and strange. I had thought the noise would cease to be an issue once we arrived, but it only seemed to get worse. As we loaded our bags on the dumbwaiter, I could swear the whistling still surrounded us. I rushed them a little, gaining some grumpy looks, but I wanted to be out of the woods and into the safety of the treehouse. Once we were safe inside, lanterns on and candy spilled on the floor, I began to feel at ease. This was our sanctuary. Nothing bad could happen to us here. We were children who had yet to experience loss or any real trauma. We were secure in our knowledge that our parents would still protect us from anything, no matter how bad it got. We were foolish, but children are supposed to be foolish, I guess. Reggie was halfway through one of his full-size candy bars the Hudsons had been passing out when Terry suggested we start the ghost stories. Terry loved scary stories, and he usually had a pretty good collection of them from the internet or wherever. Reggie pulled a beanbag chair over from the corner, and I dragged a camp chair over so I could join the group of lanterns. Typically, we would tell our stories around the fire pit, but I think we all sensed that tonight it would be better to be inside. Halloween was unique somehow. It was best to be inside after dark. Terry brought the flashlight up under his chin, tilting the light knob down on the lantern and grinning at us ghoulishly. "This is a true story. I swear it on my life," he said, before beginning his story. He told us a story about a kid plagued by the ghost of a hobo that he and his friends had accidentally killed. They had been playing a trick on him, and he had choked to death on a sandwich. After he died, the boy kept seeing him around, in windows or on street corners, but his friends hadn't believed him. Then, while the boys were at a sleepover, the ghost struck. I found myself distracted as he told the story, though. The wind blew against our treehouse, creaking it in the branches of the old tree. But beneath the wind, there was a weird sound. That same whistling was coming from outside, a high-pitched keening that was not altogether tuneless. As I listened to it, it almost seemed to move through the surrounding trees as Terry wove his tale. Terry came to the end of his story, and the boy's friends died badly. The boy escaped the sleepover and ran for his home. The ghostly hobo dogged his heels, screaming his name as he chased him through the quiet streets. But the boy had made it home and slammed the door in his rotting face. He had leaned against it, safe at last, but as the banging began, he remembered one important fact. His parents were gone, Terry said, grinning in the flashlight beam. He might have made it home, but he was still at the mercy of the ghostly apparition. Terry told us how the door had bowed inward, the ragged hands pushing the wood like wax paper, but I felt my attention dragged away again. I could still hear the whistling, closer now, and I could swear there was another noise too. Rustling leaves maybe, or leaves crackling underfoot. Was someone outside the treehouse? And as Patches pushed at his door, trying to catch him, the boy snuck out the window and disappeared into the night, never to be seen again. Terry seemed to notice then that I wasn't really paying attention. "Oh, come on. That was a great story." "Huh?" I asked. Oh yeah. Something was just distracting me outside." Reggie looked quizzically at me. What was it?" "I thought I heard someone outside moving around in the leaves." Terry turned to look at the bare window, and Reggie walked over to look out into the inky blackness. The moon cast an odd light over his face, but as he scanned the ground, it gave away no sudden surprise. He shrugged his already broad shoulders and returned to his beanbag chair. He reached for a candy bar and started unwrapping the silvery foil. "Nothing there," he said after Terry and I stared at him for a second. "Must have been the wind." Terry had begun another story about a shadowy creature that lived in a stairwell. As he laid out the narrative, though, I could hear the whistling again. It wormed into my consciousness, spinning through the trees outside like a drunken bird. I could hear the leaves crunching again, the wind making them rustle like skeletal wind chimes. And suddenly, I too wanted to go to the window and look out into the night. I was trying to listen to Terry's story, but the more I tried to pay attention to it, the more I heard the noises from below. Terry looked miffed when I interrupted his story to drag up the rope ladder. I latched the hatch and came back to find him with his arms crossed and an indignant look on his face. "Think you can do a better story? Well then, hotshot, have at it." He tossed the flashlight at me, and I caught it by reflex. I thought about it for a minute and realized I did have a story I could tell. Maybe by getting it out, I could alleviate the fear that had been consuming me. I was ruining my Halloween campout, and for what? Some noise outside the treehouse? It was probably just a raccoon or something that we had spooked when we arrived. My unease had given me the perfect story, though. So, these three kids were walking in the woods. They were going camping, and were going to a familiar spot in the woods to set up. They left their homes at dusk, wanting to camp out under the stars in just their sleeping bags. Their parents told them that if anything went wrong, they could come home and sleep there. But the boys had done this 100 times, and felt that they knew the woods like the back of their hand. They felt like nothing in the woods could surprise them. But they were wrong. Terry sneered, but he sat close to the lantern and listened nonetheless. Reggie opened another candy bar, the story drawing him in as the stories almost always did. Reggie didn't really seem to like scary things. He was kind of a fraidy cat. But he liked stories. He would sit and listen, getting more and more terrified, but always beg for another when you were done. They walked towards the determined campsite, talking animatedly about the s'mores they would make and the scary stories they would tell. One of them kept hearing something as they walked. He could hear a snap of a twig, the crunch of a leaf, and it made him wary. He told his friends but they shrugged it off as nothing. It was late afternoon, the sun was setting, and the animals were coming out to forage. They were probably just hearing animals moving around in the dry leaves. The two of them went back to walking, talking between themselves, but the third kept listening, kept looking over his shoulder to see what lay behind. Terry and Reggie were paying attention, Terry a little begrudgingly. Reggie's eyes were large and starey as he listened. As I told the story, I almost thought I could hear the leaves crackling outside, the wind in the trees rattling the dying year's foliage against the limbs, and a low whistle could be heard outside. It was tuneless and wafting as it warbled across my sanity. I knew just what was stalking these kids through the woods as I began to spin their tale. He kept asking them to listen, telling them it was important, but they wouldn't listen to him. They kept walking, kept talking, and all the while the crunching leaves and the rustling of limbs followed them, getting closer and closer. The boy became afraid. The steps sounded large, but he couldn't see anything in the trees as they proceeded down the trail. One of the others finally yelled at him, telling him to stop being stupid and just enjoy the trip. There was nothing out there. No one but he could hear it. He was being dumb. He needed to relax. I paused for dramatic effect, seeing Terry roll his eyes at the description of the boy in the story. That's when they heard the whistling. And I imagined I could still hear the whistling outside the treehouse. It was getting closer and closer as I told the story. Was the story drawing it in? Was I calling it to the treehouse? But by now, though, I couldn't stop myself. The story needed to be told, and I had become a conduit for it. I would tell it to the end, even if the whistler came right up the tree after us. They all froze when they heard the whistling. This was no wind through the boughs of a tree. This was a tuneless, monotonous whistling that cut across the dying afternoon like a sickle through wheat. It was behind them, seemingly on the trail, and they could hear it getting closer and closer. They began to make their way towards the campsite, walking a little faster, but all three looked over their shoulder now. They were all made uneasy by the whistling, and they all wanted to put some distance between themselves and it. My friend sat forward, hanging on my every word, entranced by this new development. Outside, I imagined I could hear the whistling coming from just outside the clearing. They didn't talk anymore. They didn't laugh. They didn't joke. They let their feet take them ever onward, but the whistling followed them. The friends who had insisted it was nothing said that maybe they should speed up a little bit. The campsite couldn't be far. Once they were there, they could take a side trail and get back to town. Or whatever it was might leave and they could get back to their campout. The other two agreed, but all of them knew that the campout was already canceled. None of them would sleep here tonight, not willingly. They sped up, but the whistling followed them steadily. One of them said that they should stop and confront the whistler. He must be human. Who else could whistle? The other two shot him down, though. The whistling was discordant, jangling against their nerves, sounding like nothing they had ever heard before. Both agreed that they didn't want to find out what whistled like that, and they kept moving. Something bumped the bottom of the tree, but my audience didn't seem to notice. It wasn't a hard bump. It didn't shiver the whole tree. It felt more like an inquisitive tap, a gentle knock, someone trying to get our attention. I put it out of my mind, maybe the wind or something, and kept telling my story. They kept moving, deeper and deeper into the woods, all the time being chased by the whistling. They broke into a run, the campsite still not coming into view, and still the whistling grew closer and louder. The whistling took on a life of its own, rising and falling in its chaotic tune as it became less and less discernible. The children put their hands over their ears, the noise scraping against their mind like a rusty scalpel. The hands would not block out the whistling, though. They heard it inside their heads as it battered their senses, and when the first one tripped, the other two did not stop to help him. They didn't hear his screams, but they felt a change when the whistling thing got him. A night bird called out from the forest, but now the whistling was in my own head, and I only registered it as something different. I told the story frantically, hoping it would stop the whistling in my head somehow. They dropped their packs and ran. They sprinted, flat out, knowing that the trail must be up ahead. They would round the bend, and there it would be. It would be there, as it always had been, and they would cut back towards town. It never occurred to them that the creature could just cut through the forest after them. The trail to town had a talismanic effect on them. If they could make it, then they could walk it, and then they would be safe. They ran, they wept, but the whistling followed them on and on, their feet crunching against the leaves and pine needles, sounding like gunfire, but they hardly noticed over the eerie whistling in their heads. My two friends were leaning close now, the lantern making their faces look like jack-o'-lanterns as their eyes begged for the climax. And still, that whistling assaulted me, threatening to drive me mad. If they noticed it, they gave no indication. When the second boy fell, the first never noticed. He ran and ran, trying to outdistance the whistling, trying to get it out of his head, and when his friend was found, the whistling again took on a different note. The lone boy ran and ran, hoping to outdistance the crazed whistling, knowing that his fate would be the same as his friend's if it caught him. Some say he runs to this very day. Some say the whistling got him in the end. No one knows for sure. I heard the whistling abate a little. It didn't leave, but it did lighten slightly. I felt like crying as I came to the end of my story. Maybe I would be allowed to live where the boys had died. The search parties found their backpacks 2 days later, animals having worried at them to get at the food that was inside. They found the campsite bare, no fire having been lit in weeks. Of the boys, they found no sign. No trace was ever found. Not a scrap of clothes, not a footprint. They were never seen again, but the children in the area say that you can hear the whistling in the woods on quiet nights. On those nights, it's best to stay indoors. The whistling takes all who venture too close, and the whistling will haunt you for the rest of your life, however long that may be. That was when the whistling stopped. It stopped so abruptly that I wondered if it had ever been there at all. For a 10-year-old to question his mental stability was a strange feeling, but at that moment, I was just glad it had passed me by. The other two shook off their rapture, looking as though they had been hypnotized, and Terry blew out a long breath. Well, damn, that was a good story. I can't top that, and suddenly I'm feeling kind of tired. Yeah, Reggie said dreamily. Me too. Think maybe we should go to bed. I would have argued with them on most nights, but tonight I was as drained as the rest. We laid out our sleeping bags and burrowed down, dropping off quickly without the usual chatter that preceded it. I'd like to tell you that that's where the story ends. I wish I could, but that wouldn't be doing justice to the memory of my friends. I awoke in the wee hours of the morning when someone threw a pillow at me. It was not thrown playfully. The throw was hard, angry, and directed at my face. I sat up, rubbing my cheek, and became aware of the keening whistle that had returned. It was louder than ever, and it chilled me to the bone. For God's sake, stop it, Terry yelled, staring daggers at me. Your story was good. We all said so. But trying to scare us with that stupid whistling isn't funny. I heard someone crying and looked over to see Reggie in the corner with his hands against his face. The whistling was loud and discordant, just as I had described it in my story, and it appeared that I wasn't the only one that could hear it now. Terry looked madder than I had ever seen him, and Reggie was clearly terrified after the story I had spun. It's not me, I swear, I told them. Terry glanced at me for a few seconds before realizing that I was right. He had woken me up. How could I be the whistler? He moved to the window and I joined him, trying to see the source of the whistling. Most nights we would have nothing to see but the inky blackness, but under the light of the full moon, the yard was shadowy but visible. As we scanned the yard, we could see little. The fire pit below, the logs we sat at as we toasted our marshmallows and wieners, the woodpile we had tarped against the rain. I had almost decided to go check the other window when Terry gasped like a stepped-on cat. I looked and saw a man in a long cloak step out of the tree line. He was dressed in a dark gray coat, long and flowing like a trench coat, and a tall cowboy hat, making him look almost 7 feet tall as it poked towards the sky. The toes of his pointy boots poked from beneath the coat, and I thought they looked battered and scuffed even from here. The wind seemed loath to touch him, but by the way he pulled the cloak around him, you'd have thought he was freezing. I could see a pair of eyes reflecting the moonlight as they looked up at us, and decided that he must be wearing glasses. Of him, we could see very little under the cloak, but he made us uneasy. The whistling seemed to be coming from beneath the cloak, and when it stopped, he began to speak, and I wished for the whistling again. His voice was raspy, pinched, croaksome, a dead man's pleading last words. "It's so cold, boys. Might I take shelter in your treehouse for the night?" I shuddered, not knowing what to say. Somehow, though, Terry found his voice. "Go away. Our mother told us not to talk to strangers, and we don't know you." "Please, boys, kind boys. Didn't your mother teach you hospitality? Let an old man in out of the cold," he pleaded. "No," Terry said, and moved away from the window as though the man might somehow leap through it. The man didn't yell. He didn't plead. He just sat on the log beneath our tree and continued to whistle. The jagged cords wafted up into the treehouse, and I saw Terry shudder. He picked up a boot that had been part of my costume and went to the window to throw it at the man. Terry sent it sailing, but hissed when it didn't connect. He threw several other things at the whistler, but the old man never seemed to be where he was aiming. Terry cussed loudly, reaching for the lamp. I wrapped my arm around it, begging him not to. "It's all the light we have, Terry. Please." He tore it out of my hand, growling as it came free. He chucked it at the old man, the heavy plastic thing not even getting close to the target. It broke on the ground, shattering and fizzling with an electric pop. The inside of the treehouse was darker for its passing, the three of us now sitting in near darkness. The whistling went on, though. The man never seemed to run out of breath, and the shrill noise took its toll on all of us. Reggie began to rock in the corner, sobbing loudly as the man whistled and whistled below. Terry screamed at him from the window, his rage never ending, as I covered my ears and tried to keep the threads of my sanity together. It seemed to last for hours, for days, and as I sat with my eyes closed, I prayed it would end. When I heard the floorboards creak, I opened my eyes. It was Reggie standing by the window, his foot already on the ledge. "Reggie? What are you doing?" I breathed, half getting up. Reggie looked back at me, snot runners creeping down his face. His naked face looked tortured, tears cutting lines down his dirty cheeks, still streaked with green. He smiled gruesomely at me as he framed himself in the window, and I didn't have to ask what he intended to do. I tried to stop him. I pulled myself up from the floor to go to him, but it was already too late. I just wanted to stop," he breathed, before throwing himself out the window. We never heard him hit the ground over the loud and terrible whistling. Terry stormed over to the hatch and had it unlatched before I could throw myself across it. "What are you doing?" "What do you think I'm doing? I'm gonna go do something about this guy." "He's an adult, Terry. You can't do anything to him." "Get out of my way. I'm going out there." "He's scary, Terry. You shouldn't go out there. You'll end up like Reggie. Terry kicked me, sending waves of pain through my guts, and I rolled off the trap door. I heard him throw it open and toss the ladder down, descending in a shriek of rage as he made his way towards the whistler. As scared as it had made Reggie, the whistler had made Terry a furious juggernaut. I drew myself up, my ribs hurting as I hobbled to the trap door. I looked down before closing it, and gasped in horror against my throbbing chest. The man was at the bottom of the ladder. His face was still hidden by the coat, his eyes a glistening twosome amidst the swirling dark void, and I could see thick red fluid around the collar of that cloak. He was 2 rungs up the ladder, temporarily frozen by my gaze, and I slammed the hatch and threw the lock a second before he slammed into it. I crawled away from the hatch, seeing it buck wildly and hearing him scream at me to open it. He cussed and howled like an angry animal, wanting to get in, but stopped by the strong bolt that some past child had installed on the sturdy hatch. Maybe they had installed it to keep him out, I thought. My fear overtopped me at some point as I watched the door jump in its frame, and I must have passed out. When the banging woke me up, it was daylight, and I screamed loud enough to startle whoever was banging. "Easy, kid, it's Sheriff Blasky. Are you okay?" I dragged myself to the hatch, my ribs aching, and threw the bolt before falling back, panting. If it was the Whistler, I hoped he was quick at least. My ribs would turn out to be broken, and their healing would encompass 2 of the worst months of my life. Every time I breathed in, I was reminded of the Whistler and that last encounter with Terry. At that moment, though, I didn't care what happened. I just wanted it to end. Sheriff Blasky pushed the flap open, though, and I guessed I'd get to live another day. He took me to the hospital. He took me into the waiting arms of my parents, who pulled me into their warm embrace and threatened to never let me go. I'd been missing for 2 days, they told me, and when the police had seen the state of our treehouse, they feared the worst. They never found any sign of Terry or Reggie. I told them what had happened. I told them about the whistling man, about Reggie's fall, and Terry charging him from the treehouse. I told them about how I'd locked the trap door and passed out as I watched the man trying to batter his way in. They took my statement, searched those woods with officers and dogs and every able-bodied set of legs they could find in town, but they never found anything. Not a scrap of cloth, not a drop of blood. My friends were just gone. That was 8 years ago. I've seen that night in my dreams every night since. The events live on in my memories, and I often wake up screaming as the man tries to break that hatch open. In my dreams, I don't pass out. In my dreams, the hatch doesn't hold. In my dreams, I wake up as he wraps his hands around my throat and drags me towards that pitch-black maw he hides behind his coat. I haven't been back in the forest since that day. I don't think I ever will. Lately, though, I've been hearing the whistling as I lay in bed at night. I look out the window, my backyard butting up to the woods, and see 2 small figures hovering on the outskirts. Sometimes the man in the coat is there too, but I know better than to try to tell my parents. They're gone when they get there, and I just end up looking crazy. I leave for college next week, and I've chosen one in the middle of a big city. I plan to attend it because the closest collection of more than 4 trees is 60 miles from my dorm. I'm hoping that distance will stop this apparition, but I just don't know. I can hear the whistling now, even as I write this. I can hear my dead friend's soft call as they entice me to come out to play. I can hear that whistling as it scrapes across my nerves yet again. I hear it, and I hope that I get to leave for college before it becomes too much for me to bear, before it calls me back to the treehouse once again. I sighed as I saw the toll booth looming up in front of us. My wife and I had driven down this road 1,000 times in the 10 years we'd been married. It was actually the place we took our first date, and we loved to drive down it on Sundays and feel nostalgic. Despite the number of times we've driven the long and winding route, the toll booth always surprises me a little. It sounds weird to say that our first date was a drive, but I think it was honestly pretty sweet. I'm a photographer, have been since I was 19, and I often shoot weddings and family photos for people in the area. I've got an amazing eye for location, and my photos have been featured in not just people's homes, but also in magazines that debut the beauty of North Georgia and the Carolinas. The Appalachians have been my home since I was born, and I know how to bring out her beauty in my photos. I was 22 and on my way to a wedding when I spotted a car on the side of the road with a young woman sitting on the hood. She waved her hands at me, asking if I would stop, and I rolled down my window to see if I could help. She said her car had broken down and was wondering if I could help her out. I'm no mechanic, and my car knowledge stops at changing my oil, so I offered her a ride to the wedding I was attending so she could call a wrecker. She agreed and ended up hanging out with me the whole wedding. The wrecker couldn't get there for 3 or 4 hours, and I was the only person that she knew. So, in between photo shoots, we talked. I got her some food. Weddings usually have a little extra, and this one was more of a country union than a black tie affair. We sat around and chatted as I took some candid shots. We discovered that we actually had a lot in common, and when the wrecker called her, she told him to just drop it off at her mechanic. I drove her home afterwards and invited her to dinner with me later that week. I know what you'll say, it wasn't a real date, but it meant something to us, and we've considered it our first date for years. We even went back on our first anniversary to put a marker where her car had broken down. It may be a little macabre, but we put a wreath there to commemorate her little coupe. It had died on that spot the day we met. We still keep that wreath up. We stop at it sometimes so we can remember how we came to know each other. The spot where her car died is about 2 miles from the toll booth. The toll booth is an oddity. It's just a random toll booth out in the middle of the woods. You put 50 cents in the basket, the booth is never manned, and you head on your way. I have no idea who comes to collect the money. I don't imagine it makes a lot of it, but it's probably some senator's nest egg for when he gets put out of office. We always keep change in the car for just such an occasion, not minding paying a little toll to see the road that started our happy life. Today, however, I couldn't find 50 cents in the cup holder. It's been a busy week. We just put a down payment on our new house, my wife just started a new job, and I had just finished shooting a big wedding that more than paid for the down payment on the new house. But it left us a little light otherwise. We had cashed in our change jar that sat in the cup holder, something to get us by till payday, and I had forgotten to put more change in it afterwards for the toll road. The drive was kind of our date night this weekend. We had a picnic in the back seat, and we were going to go up to the lake where the wedding had been held. The lake was where we had our own wedding, and we went there often to picnic or swim or just enjoy a quiet afternoon together. "What's the matter?" Carol asked. I dug a nickel out from between the seats and weighed the pathetic little pile of change. 5 pennies, 2 dimes, and a nickel were all I had managed to find under the seats. The arm hung stoically across the road, little more than a wooden suggestion than a real barrier. I had thought many times that I could probably just drive through it and be done with the stupid thing, but such things were a little too rebellious for me. "You got any change?" I asked, doubting she did, but wanting to be sure. "No," she said, looking through her purse before exclaiming, "Aha!" and dropping another nickel onto my palm. "Well, that's a little better, but it's not quite 50 cents. Just dig some out of the change cup," she said. I shook the cup at her, reminding that we had recently traded it in. "Oh yeah. Well, what shall we do, my dear?" I considered turning around, maybe just forgetting the whole thing, but a new idea suddenly bubbled to the surface. I pulled onto the soft shoulder of the road, the car protesting as much as my wife. I'm sure my car's wheels were going to bog down any minute. The shoulder of the road is soft turf and seed grass, and I expected my tires would spew up earth and stick. I'd have to sheepishly explain to some highway patrolman how I'd gotten stuck then. To my surprise, though, I drove easily around the barrier. I laughed and wondered why I hadn't simply done this before. "What are you doing?" my wife asked, half laughing but also half aghast. "We've given this thing 50 cents loads of times. I think it can give us a pass, just this once." We both laughed as we drove away from the lonely little toll booth, but I think even then, I felt a slight twinge on the back of my neck. I would remember it later and realize I had been warned. We drove down the familiar road, taking in nature's bounty and chuckling at our daring. The trees were ablaze with early fall oranges and deep, healthy greens. The sky was a perfect robin's egg blue, and I just knew that the lake would be wonderful today. We could watch the sunset, maybe have a little fire before going home, and snuggling in bed at the end of a perfect day. It was a good plan, but someone had a different one, it seemed. As we drove, my wife watched the leaves with interest. My wife is an unofficial leaf looker, though she would never admit it, and our house has many pictures of beautiful foliage. As I drove, the roads winding onward, I saw her lift her head from the car window and squint at the passing colors. We were both getting on in years, no spring chickens now, but the look she was giving the leaves was decidedly prudish. It was like an old maid who simply can't believe Miss Tyler let her daughter out in that skirt. "John, does something seem off about the trees?" she asked, sounding perplexed. I looked at the trees, the oranges and reds and greens looking completely natural to me, and I told her so. It does, but it doesn't. It's like seeing trees on television. They look kind of glossy, recorded even. I I don't know how to describe it. They just look a little weird. I brushed it off, thinking maybe she was seeing things. It had been a long week, and we had been through some pretty stressful times. It was enough to make anyone a little jangled. She kept watching the trees, but I'd put my eyes back on the road, wanting to be there already. We had driven for about another 30 minutes, though, when I had to slow down. Sitting in the road, white and brown with a glossy oak arm, was the toll booth. I stopped and looked around, thinking somebody might be playing a little joke, but there was no one around. The toll booth looked exactly as it had before. It was simulated wood grain, and the walls were painted a dark brown and creamy white. The arm was simulated oak with a glossy finish. It looked exactly like the toll booth, but it couldn't be. Could it? Maybe they thought they'd put up another one, my wife asked, smiling but clearly confused. I laughed a little at that. They were getting a little greedy out here, weren't they? I pulled around this one too, and I watched it disappear in the rearview mirror as we made our way down the road. My wife was still looking raptly at the trees as we drove past, her attention becoming unhealthy. When she asked me to take a look, I glanced over to see the unusual reds and oranges and greens, but something did look a little off about them. Had they become even more vibrant? The foliage looked artificial, almost neon, and it battered against my eyes as we watched them go past. Okay, there's no way you can tell me that was just my imagination. I didn't answer her. I just wanted to get to the lake so we could have our picnic and all would be normal again. This was weird, yeah, but it was just a strange phenomenon. We would make it to the lake and everything would be okay. When we drove here next weekend, or the weekend after that, everything would be just as it had always been. I edged my speed up a little, wanting to pass the weird Technicolor trees and get into the deep woods I knew were coming. We had driven for about another half hour when my brakes screeched against the pavement. I blinked. It just couldn't be. I had been driving these roads for 10 years, and it was always just the one toll booth. My wife seemed startled too, leaning forward to look unbelievingly at the little booth. It looked exactly like the other two, but that was impossible. We had passed it twice, and I was sure there was only one toll booth out here. There would be no reason to think a second one would make any difference. There was so little traffic out here. What the hell? My wife asked. And when I pulled around the arm this time, it was a little more aggressively than I meant to. Maybe, she started, pausing a little as she looked nervously at me. Maybe we should just pay the toll. I didn't say anything. I had been too mad to even acknowledge the prickle on the back of my neck this time. Stupid, money-grubbing jerks. They hadn't figured they could line their pockets enough with just one toll booth, so they had to have two more. This was unbelievable. I had a sense of humor about the first one, but if they thought they were going to gouge me for another toll, babe, they had another thing coming. I was going to write my congressman, my senator. I'd write the freaking president about this. They couldn't just, John, gouge people like this. What about tourism? What about local beauty spots? What the hell happened to bringing people out so they could, John! I stopped on the brakes and turned to yell, "What?" at my wife as she stared out the window. Normally, she would have chastised me for yelling at her. I don't think I had yelled at her more than a couple of times our whole marriage, but she was too shaken to even take notice. She was looking out the window, staring at the trees with the strange leaves and pointing with a shaky finger. Look, she stuttered, and I turned to see what she was babbling about. The leaves were still eye-destroyingly bright, but this time they were also melting off the trees. Not regular melting either, but like wet paint dripping off an oversaturated object. I could see them dribbling onto the ground, pooling on the grass as the verdant green lawns became spin art. I put my eyes forward, racing the engine, and tried to reach what I knew was ahead as fast as I possibly could. The toll booth came into view again, but I didn't stop this time. What are you doing?" my wife said, getting nervous as I didn't slow down. I gunned the engine, revving to 70 on the straightaway. "Stop it. Stop. Don't do that." The engine growled as I nudged it up to 80. "John," my wife screamed, but it was too late. I crashed through the wooden arm and laughed maniacally as the wooden pieces cascaded off the hood and flew to either side. I had made a lot of mistakes that day, but damaging the booth, that was the worst one. My wife screeched when I hit the arm, but one look at me had reduced her to silence. I glanced over at her and immediately felt sorry for what I had done. My foot came off the ignition, and the car slowly spun to a stop in the middle of the two-lane road. I had damaged state property. I was sure there was some sort of camera on the booth somewhere, and it would be easy enough to see me ramming the arm. I thought about driving back to the booth and seeing if there was a number I could call to report the accident, but finally I just decided to keep going so we could make it to the lake before dark. As I drove, I realized my wife had been silent the whole time. I turned to tell her I was sorry, to apologize for going a little nuts back there, but she wasn't paying any attention to me at all. She was looking at the countryside as it rolled by. "Honey, I'm sorry about all that. I just let it all get to me. I'm sorry for yelling. Sorry for acting like a psycho. I was just so... The trees are wrong, John." Her voice sounded on the edge of hysteria. "What?" I asked, craning my neck around. "They're all dead. They're all dead, John." I turned right, wanting to see what she was talking about, but when I saw the trees, I wasn't sure why it had taken me so long to see. The trees, so vibrant and colorful before, were now sickly and forlorn. The vibrant colors had oozed right out of them, and the leaves hung limply from the trees as their bark hung pale and peeling. It wasn't just the trees either. The sky looked yellow and sick. It made no sense. What the hell was going on? This was nothing like how the road usually was. It was nothing like how it had looked the first time we'd seen the toll booth. I put my foot down on the ignition and we kept rolling forward towards our destination. It only got weirder the longer we drove. The longer we drove, the more I expected to run into that toll booth again. The longer I drove and didn't encounter that ramshackled booth, the more paranoid I became. The world outside didn't help much either. The sky became darker and darker as we went. The leaves began to drop from the trees in droves. The limbs were skeletal, the bark crumbling from the long, fragile limbs, and the farther we traveled, the more desiccated they became. We should have come to the deep woods by now. We should have come to the lake by now. We should have seen another car, seen a deer, seen something. My wife stopped looking out the window, and I kept sneaking glances at her to make sure she was okay. She just sat hunkered against the seat, rubbing her shoulders as she tried not to notice what was going on outside. I should have been worried about her. I should have stopped to make sure she was okay, but I was feeling on the verge of mental collapse myself. We never made it to our destination, little as I would have wanted to get out if we had. As the sun began to set, I realized how much worse it could get. "Honey," I whispered, not sure how long it had been since we'd spoken. It felt like days, weeks, but my mind railed against this idea. We were just a little lost on a road we had driven so many times we could have set the mile markers. I wasn't sure what was going on here, but I was sure that we would come out of it okay. "We shouldn't have driven around it." "What?" I asked, confused by her answer. "We shouldn't have hurt the toll booth." She turned towards me and she looked afraid. "We should have just paid the toll. Now it's mad, and it might never let us get off this road." "That's nonsense," I said, but it lacked conviction. I had been out here at night before, driving home after a day on the lake, but I had never seen it this dark. The trees no longer looked to be the old pines that I'd come to love. The trees I could see from the headlights looked more like maples, with a thick dark sap running out of them. If I looked too long at them, some of them even seemed to have faces. I always looked away when I noticed this, afraid to meet their gaze, but I could feel them looking at me nonetheless, challenging me to meet their eyes. As much as I wanted to tell her she was wrong, I couldn't argue the fact that we seemed to be stuck, and it had all started after we drove around the toll booth. "Quick, dig under the seat and see if you can find 15 cents. She looked at me in disbelief. "What? 15 cents? That way, if we see the toll booth again, we can pay the toll and get out of here," I nearly growled at her. She moved slowly, like someone in a dream. She began to search under the seats for change, and as she searched, I kept driving. I was beginning to believe that something outside the norm might be at play here, and the further we drove, the more I also believed that we were being followed. The moon hung overhead, the bright yellow moon like a kid's Halloween drawing, and by that popcorn yellow beam, I could see things running through the woods. They loped along like big dogs, their bodies oddly elongated, and their legs thick and long. I never got more than a quick look at them, but that look was enough. I think I see a quarter in the track of the seat, but I can't get it. Can you pull over so I can reach it? I gritted my teeth, but a quarter would get us there for sure. I pulled over slowly, my lights still glaring into the woods, and told her to please be quick. My wife stepped out, getting down beside the car so she could reach below the seat. I glanced around nervously, watching the woods for signs of the creatures. My wife was saying how she almost had it, but it kept slipping through her fingers. I told her to be quick, and when I looked back at the tree line, I saw one. It was like a mountain lion that had been dipped in tar. It was like a massive cat with black ridges of overlapping plates. I imagined I could see the headlights reflected off its grinning mouth full of razor-sharp teeth, and its claws clicked impatiently on the edge of the pavement. "Carol," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the creatures. "I've almost got it," she growled through gritted teeth. The creature didn't seem to have eyes, but its head turned menacingly towards the car as Carol spoke. As the quarter came free, I reached down and grabbed her by the collar of her t-shirt, lifting her into the car. My wife isn't large, maybe 5 feet, but at that moment it wouldn't have mattered if she'd been a giant. I pulled her back into the car and pushed my foot down on the accelerator as hard as I could, the door bumping shut as we got back on the road. If I had hesitated even a moment longer, we'd likely be dead. As it was, I clipped the beastie in the side of the head instead of full in the side. The chest of the creature would have caved the front of my car in, but its head whipped heavily to the side as it broke one of the headlights. I barely noticed as I flew down the road at 70, the other creatures in hot pursuit. We were doing 90 as we barreled forward, but I could see the pack of nightmare hounds right behind us. The rear lights lit their chitinous faces hellishly, and I took the hairpin turns with wheel-screeching accuracy. I'm no NASCAR driver, but the sight of those creatures behind me was enough to push me onward. If they caught me, we'd both be dead. If I crashed, we'd both be dead anyway. Seemed like either way, our options were pretty limited. They followed us for a long while, too long for creatures their size. I was driving 90 most of the time, but they kept pace as easy as if I'd been going 20. I was keeping ahead of them, but only just. I felt them bump the back bumper more than once. They seemed intent on forcing me off the road, but they couldn't quite hit hard enough to force me off. My wife shuddered every time we got hit, and I found myself barely able to keep it on the road after every successful strike. After some indiscriminate amount of time, I looked in the rearview mirror to find that we were alone again. A few minutes later, I saw the toll booth come up into view, but not the one I was used to seeing. This toll booth was black, the paneling looking like the skin on those creatures, and the arm looked like an unprocessed tree trunk. I didn't hesitate. I dropped the money into the basket, whispering sorry as the arm slid up to permit us. We pulled through the turnstile, and it was like crossing some kind of barrier into another world. My grandmother had grown up in Ireland and had sometimes told me stories about people who crossed the barrier between their world and into the realm of Fae. Grandma always said that people could cross into the fairy realm without realizing it, but I knew all too well when I crossed the border out of whatever place we had been in. It was like passing under the coldest waterfall I could imagine. We got home without incident, but it's the craziest thing. We had voicemails from our friends, a client, and even my wife's new job, asking where we were and why we'd been gone for so long. It seemed that even though we had left just after lunch on Sunday, we didn't return till Tuesday night. The car's still damaged, so I know we didn't imagine it. The car is damn near out of gas, and the oil shows that it's almost due for an oil change, despite having been done less than a month ago. I don't know what the hell happened to us, but I know I'll be keeping money in the cup holder from now on. Whether we ever choose to go down that road again or not, I will always have money to feed the toll booths that may appear in my life. You never know where they might take you if you don't play by the rules.